I was part of the 3I Atlas research team, and this is the truth about it. No one talks about. True story. Before I start, do me a favor. Comment where you're listening from. Bedroom, car, headphones at night. Doesn't matter. Just tell me. Because if this story disappears tomorrow, at least I'll know somebody somewhere heard it before I was erased. My name is Staff Sergeant Marcus Webb, and what I'm about to tell you will make you question everything you thought you knew about national security, human experimentation, and the line between protection and perdition. They recruited me because I was good at my job. They destroyed me because I was good at asking questions. And now, with geometric patterns crawling up my arms and voices in languages I shouldn't understand echoing through my skull, I'm racing against time to tell you the truth before I stop being human enough to care. The knock came at 3:17 a.m., sharp and deliberate against my apartment door in Fort Bragg, North Carolina. I wasn't expecting anyone, and in my line of work, 8 years as an Army Ranger specializing in biohazard containment and CBRN defense, unexpected visitors at that hour usually meant one thing: deployment. I rolled out of bed, muscle memory from countless midnight call-ups taking over as my feet hit the cold floor. My hand instinctively reached for the Glock I kept in the nightstand drawer, fingers wrapping around the familiar weight. My wife, Jennifer, stirred beside me, her voice thick with sleep. "Marcus, what's wrong?" I touched her shoulder gently. "Stay here." Probably nothing. But my heart was already accelerating, that combat-honed instinct that kept me alive in Kandahar whispering that something was off. The knocking stopped as suddenly as it had started, leaving only the hum of our refrigerator and the distant sound of traffic from Bragg Boulevard. I approached the door carefully, keeping my body to the side of the frame. Old habits die hard when those habits kept you breathing in hostile territory. The peephole showed nothing but empty hallway, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of fluorescent lighting that never quite reached the corners. I waited another 30 seconds, counting my heartbeats the way I'd been trained, before slowly turning the deadbolt. When I cracked the door open, there was nobody there, just a manila envelope lying on my doormat like a sleeping serpent, thick and official looking. No markings on the outside except my name typed in military precision, SSGT Marcus J. Webb. I scanned the hallway one more time, noting the security camera at the end of the corridor that should have caught whoever delivered this. I'd check the footage later. For now, I picked up the envelope, noting its weight. Definitely documents, maybe photographs, and shut the door, locking both the deadbolt and the chain. Jennifer was sitting up now, her face illuminated by the blue light of her phone's clock. "What is it?" I turned the envelope over in my hands, looking for any indication of its origin. "I don't know yet." Inside, I found a letter printed on heavy cardstock, the kind of paper that screamed government expense account. At the top was a logo I'd never seen before, a triangle within a triangle within a triangle, with what looked like DNA helixes spiraling through the geometric pattern. Below it, in stark black letters, 3I Atlas Research Initiative, Department of Defense Special Access Program. My pulse quickened. Special access programs were the kind of classified operations that existed in the shadows beyond top secret, the projects that didn't appear on any official budget and whose very existence was compartmentalized to the point of near invisibility. I'd held a TSSCI clearance for 6 years and had never heard a whisper about 3I Atlas. The letter was addressed to me personally, and as I read, I felt that strange mixture of pride and dread that comes when someone in power has been watching you closely. Staff Sergeant Webb, your exemplary service record and specialized expertise in biological threat assessment and containment protocols have been reviewed by senior leadership within the Department of Defense. You have been selected for consideration in a program of critical national security importance. The work is classified at the highest levels. The compensation is commensurate with the extraordinary nature of the assignment. I read those words 3 times, my mind already calculating what highest levels meant and why they'd approached me in the middle of the night like some Cold War spy novel. The letter continued with bureaucratic precision, outlining the basics without revealing anything substantive: a 3-year contract, relocation to a secure facility, location to be disclosed upon acceptance, limited but regular contact with family, and then the number that made my breath catch. $340,000 annual salary with full benefits, housing allowance, and a $100,000 signing bonus deposited upon contract execution. I did the math automatically. That was more than 5 times my current military pay. That was enough to finally afford the experimental treatment for Sarah, my 7-year-old daughter who'd been diagnosed with a rare form of juvenile arthritis that was slowly stealing her mobility. Jennifer and I had been drowning in medical bills, watching our savings evaporate while insurance companies found creative ways to deny coverage. This money could change everything. This money could save my daughter's future. But nothing in my experience suggested that the government offered that kind of compensation out of generosity. High pay meant high risk, high classification, or work that required moral compromises most people wouldn't make. I thought about the biohazard scenarios I'd trained for: Ebola outbreaks, weaponized anthrax, experimental pathogens that could wipe out cities. Was this related to that? The letter provided a phone number and an address in Las Vegas, a hotel, not a government building, which itself was unusual. I was instructed to appear for an informational interview in 48 hours. No mention of consequences for declining, but the implication hung in the air like cordite after a firefight. This wasn't really optional. People who got recruited for programs like this had already been vetted, investigated, and deemed both capable and controllable. Saying no might not end my career, but it would certainly mark me as someone who'd been approached and refused. In the intelligence community, that kind of flag on your record could haunt you. Jennifer found me at the kitchen table an hour later. The letter spread out in front of me next to my laptop, where I'd spent the last 45 minutes searching for any information about 3I Atlas. Google returned nothing. Not a single hit beyond the mythological Atlas and random acronyms that had nothing to do with defense contracting. I tried searching for the logo, for the phrase interspecies intelligence integration, which I'd guessed might be what the 3I stood for, and came up empty. Even the defense contractor databases I had access to through my work showed no contracts, no programs, no paper trail whatsoever. It was as if the organization didn't exist, which paradoxically confirmed that it absolutely did. The programs that left no digital footprints were the ones operating in the darkest corners of national security. Jennifer sat down across from me, her eyes tired but alert. "Marcus, what's going on? You've been staring at that computer like it's going to explode." I slid the letter across the table to her, watching her expression shift from curiosity to confusion to something approaching fear as she read. Is this real?" she asked, looking up at me with those green eyes that had first caught my attention 12 years ago at a coffee shop near base. "Is this some kind of test or a scam?" I shook my head. "It's real. The letterhead, the security protocols mentioned, the way it was delivered. This is legitimate DoD. And whoever they are, they've done their homework on us." I didn't need to explain what I meant. The salary figure wasn't random. It was calculated to be exactly what we desperately needed. They knew about Sarah. They knew about our medical debt. They'd profiled us financially and psychologically, determining that I could be motivated by the right incentive structure. Jennifer's hands trembled slightly as she set the letter down. "What kind of work requires this much money and this much secrecy?" That was the question that had been gnawing at me since I'd opened the envelope. "I don't know, but I think I need to find out." She looked at me for a long moment, and I could see the war playing out behind her eyes. Fear of the unknown versus hope for our daughter's future. The instinct to protect our family versus the reality that protection required resources we didn't have. "You're going to the meeting," she said finally. It wasn't a question. I nodded slowly, just to hear what they have to say. I'm not committing to anything without knowing what I'm getting into. But even as I said it, I felt the invisible hooks already setting in my flesh. They'd chosen their moment perfectly, approached me when I was desperate enough to listen but experienced enough to be useful. Whatever 3I Atlas was, whatever they wanted me to do in exchange for that life-changing salary, I was already halfway to saying yes before I'd even heard the pitch. That's how they got you. That's how they always got you. They found your pressure point, your sick kid, your dying parent, your mountain of debt, and they applied just enough force to make the impossible seem necessary. I thought about the classified projects I'd heard whispers about over the years, the experiments and operations that officially never happened. I thought about the soldiers who came back from special assignments changed, their eyes carrying a weight that had nothing to do with combat stress. 2 days later, I was on a plane to Las Vegas, having told my commanding officer I was taking emergency leave for family medical reasons, which wasn't entirely a lie. The signing bonus alone could cover Sarah's treatment for the next 2 years. As the aircraft descended over the Nevada desert, I stared out at the sprawling city emerging from the wasteland like a mirage, all glittering lights and desperate dreams. Somewhere down there, in an unmarked hotel conference room, people I'd never met were waiting to offer me a deal I couldn't refuse. They were going to tell me about technology and research that would sound like science fiction. They were going to show me things that would challenge everything I thought I knew about biology, consciousness, and what it meant to be human. And then they were going to ask me to sign away 3 years of my life to a project that didn't officially exist, in a facility I couldn't locate on any map, doing work I couldn't discuss with anyone, including my wife. What I didn't know, as the wheels touched down on the runway, was that those 3 years would be the last time I'd truly be Marcus Webb. The man I was, the father, the husband, the soldier, was about to be systematically dismantled and rebuilt into something else entirely. Something that could no longer look at his daughter without seeing her as a biological system to be optimized. Something that would eventually stop recognizing the name Marcus as anything more than a designation for previous iteration. But I'm getting ahead of myself. First, I had to walk into that hotel. First, I had to meet Colonel Brennan and Dr. Vasquez. First, I had to hear the lie they'd perfected over 60 years of recruitment, that what they were doing was for the defense of humanity, when in truth, they'd stopped defending humans decades ago. They were building something new. And I was about to become part of the prototype. The Mirage Hotel on the Las Vegas Strip was exactly the kind of place where secrets went to hide in plain sight. Too crowded, too loud, too transient for anyone to notice a military man in civilian clothes walking through the casino floor at 9 a.m. But I wasn't meeting in the main tower. My instructions directed me to the business center annex, a separate building connected by a pedestrian bridge where convention organizers rented anonymous conference rooms by the hour. Room 4J was at the end of a quiet hallway, far from the slots and the desperate tourists, with no signage and no windows. I knocked twice, as instructed, and the door opened immediately. The man who answered was in his 60s, built like a retired linebacker going to seed, with iron gray hair cut in a military high and tight that had gone out of fashion a decade ago. But it was his eyes that caught my attention. Pale blue, utterly cold, assessing me the way a butcher evaluates a side of beef. A scar ran from just below his left ear down to his collarbone. The kind of wound that spoke of violence survived, but not forgotten. "Staff Sergeant Webb," he said without preamble, his voice carrying the clipped authority of someone who'd spent a lifetime giving orders and expecting immediate obedience. "I'm Colonel David Brennan. Come in." It wasn't a request. The conference room was aggressively ordinary. Beige walls, corporate art that meant nothing, a long table with 8 chairs, and absolutely no technology visible except for a laptop that sat closed in front of the room's other occupant. She stood as I entered, extending her hand with a professional smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Dr. Lena Vasquez," she said, her grip firm, her accent carrying the faint traces of Southern California, overlaid with years of academic precision. Biochemistry and advanced systems integration. She was perhaps in her early 40s, dark hair pulled back in a severe ponytail, wearing a charcoal blazer over a black turtleneck despite the Nevada heat outside. What struck me immediately was the exhaustion in her face, not the temporary fatigue of a bad night's sleep, but the deep, existential weariness of someone who'd been carrying an unbearable weight for far too long. Her eyes had the 1,000-yard stare I'd seen in combat veterans, that particular hollowness that comes from witnessing things that fundamentally alter your understanding of reality. Colonel Brennan gestured to a chair across from them. "Sit. We have exactly 90 minutes for this conversation, and what we discuss does not leave this room." I sat, my training automatically cataloging details. Emergency exits, the slight bulge under Brennan's jacket that suggested a sidearm, the way Dr. Vasquez's fingers trembled slightly as she opened the laptop. "Before we begin," Brennan continued, sliding a thin folder across the table to me, "understand that your security clearance has been reviewed and upgraded under special authority. You now hold TSSCI with additional SAP access, code-worded Atlas Meridian. The information we're about to share is compartmentalized at the highest level of classification, above top secret, beyond the knowledge of most general officers, congressional oversight committees, and yes, even most personnel at the Pentagon." He paused, letting that sink in. "If you walk out of this room, you will be debriefed. Your temporary clearance will be revoked, and you will sign documentation swearing that this meeting never occurred. But you will always know that it did. You will carry that knowledge for the rest of your life, wondering what we were doing and whether you made the right choice in declining. It was a masterful piece of psychological manipulation. The implicit threat wrapped in the promise of forbidden knowledge. The suggestion that walking away would haunt me more than agreeing. I opened the folder. Inside was a single sheet of paper with a briefing title. 3I Atlas, Advanced Tissue and Lifeform Adaptation Studies, Biological Defense Initiative. Below it, a mission statement that read like something from a science fiction novel. To develop integrated biological technological systems capable of defending against asymmetric threats through the controlled adaptation of recovered non-terrestrial biotechnology. I read it 3 times before I looked up. Non-terrestrial, I said carefully. You're talking about alien technology, Doctor. Vasquez leaned forward, her exhaustion momentarily displaced by something that looked like passion, or perhaps obsession. We're talking about the greatest scientific discovery in human history, Staff Sergeant. And yes, to use the colloquial term, alien, extraterrestrial, not from Earth. She opened the laptop and turned it to face me. On the screen was a photograph of what looked like a piece of machinery, or perhaps biological tissue. It was impossible to tell. The object was roughly cylindrical, about the size of a human forearm, with a surface that seemed to shift between metallic and organic textures. Geometric patterns covered its exterior, fractals that hurt to look at directly, because they seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process. This was recovered in 1947 outside Roswell, New Mexico, Vasquez continued, along with several similar artifacts and, though this remains highly classified, biological material from non-human entities. For 78 years, various government programs have been attempting to understand and reverse engineer this technology. We've had varying degrees of success. She clicked to another image. This one showing the same object, but with portions of it seeming to grow into what looked disturbingly like human tissue. But nothing compared to what we've achieved in the last 2 decades. Colonel Brennan took over, his voice flat and factual, delivering information that should have been impossible with the casual authority of someone reading a weather report. In 2003, researchers at Los Alamos made a breakthrough. They discovered that this technology, we still don't fully understand if it's artificial or biological in origin, responds to human DNA. Specifically, it responds to living human tissue by initiating a form of integration. He paused, choosing his words carefully. The objects are not inert. They're programmable at a level that makes our most advanced nanotechnology look like stone tools. When exposed to human cellular structures, they begin a process of adaptation and enhancement. They interface with the nervous system, augment muscular tissue, enhance sensory capabilities, and demonstrate what can only be described as intelligent behavior. I felt my pulse quicken, that old combat instinct screaming warnings that my rational mind was still trying to process. Enhancement, I said slowly. You're talking about human experimentation. Vasquez's expression hardened. We're talking about defense, Staff Sergeant. China has their own recovery program. Russia has been working on similar technology since the 1960s. We have intelligence suggesting that at least 3 other nation-states have access to recovered materials. This isn't science fiction. It's an arms race, and we're barely keeping pace. Brennan slid another document across the table, a glossy presentation folder with medical imagery, charts showing cellular structures I didn't recognize, and photographs of men in military uniforms standing in laboratory settings, their exposed skin showing faint, intricate patterns that looked like tattoos but seemed to glow with internal light. The 3I Atlas program recruits military personnel with specific skill sets, biohazard expertise, medical training, engineering backgrounds, to participate in controlled integration studies. You would be part of the research and security team, not a test subject, he clarified, though something in his tone suggested that distinction might be more flexible than he was letting on. Your job would be to oversee biosafety protocols, monitor integration procedures, and ensure containment of both the technology and the human subjects undergoing adaptation. The facility is located in a secure subterranean installation in Nevada. You would live on site for the duration of your 3-year contract, with scheduled family visits every 6 months. All communications are monitored. All research is compartmentalized. You would know only what you need to know for your specific duties. He leaned back, studying me with those cold blue eyes. The pay is what we outlined in your recruitment letter. The work is legal under special executive orders that supersede standard medical ethics protocols. And what you learn there will change how you understand reality itself. The question is, are you capable of keeping those secrets, even from your wife, even from yourself, when the weight of what you've seen becomes unbearable? I signed the NDA 3 hours after the interview began, my hand cramping by page 37 as I initialed clause after clause that essentially made me government property for the next 3 years. The document was a masterpiece of legal intimidation. 47 pages of dense text outlining penalties that ranged from immediate imprisonment to civil forfeiture of all assets, with special emphasis on a clause stating that any breach of confidentiality could be prosecuted as treason in a closed military tribunal with no right to civilian legal counsel. There were sections about involuntary commitment to secure psychiatric facilities if I showed signs of compromised mental stability, vague language that basically gave them permission to lock me away forever if I became inconvenient. Dr. Vasquez watched me sign with that same exhausted expression, and I wondered how many times she'd witnessed this exact moment. How many soldiers had sat in this chair and signed away their autonomy for money they desperately needed. When I finished, Colonel Brennan collected the documents without ceremony and told me I had 72 hours to settle my affairs. I wasn't allowed to tell Jennifer where I was going, only that it was classified and necessary. The signing bonus appeared in our account that afternoon. $100,000 that felt less like a gift and more like blood money for a choice I couldn't unmake. Saying goodbye to Sarah was the hardest thing I've ever done. She was in the backyard, drawing with sidewalk chalk, her movement still mostly fluid despite the disease that was slowly stiffening her joints. "Daddy's going away for work," I told her, kneeling down so we were eye level. "For a long time, but the money I'm making means we can get you better medicine, okay? The kind that'll make your hands stop hurting." She looked at me with those serious brown eyes that were too old for a 7-year-old. "Will you come back?" Children have an instinct for the questions adults don't want to answer. I hugged her tight, memorizing the smell of her strawberry shampoo, the way her small body fit against mine. "I'll come back," I promised, and I meant it. I had no way of knowing that the man who would eventually return to this house would look like me, sound like me, but wouldn't recognize his own daughter as anything more than a biological system requiring optimization. That Marcus Webb, the father who read bedtime stories and played Tea Party, was living his last days of existence, and neither of us knew it. Jennifer held me that night without speaking, her tears soaking my shoulder, both of us pretending we believed everything would be fine. The extraction happened exactly as Colonel Brennan had described: clinical, efficient, and deliberately disorienting. A black van with government plates arrived at 0400 hours, and 2 stone-faced military police personnel escorted me inside. The moment the doors closed, one of them produced a blackout hood. "Standard security protocol, Sergeant Webb," he said in a tone that suggested compliance wasn't optional. "No one who enters the facility knows its exact location. You'll understand why." The hood went on, and my world became darkness and the rumble of the engine. I tried to track our movements, turns, stops, acceleration patterns, but after what felt like 3 hours of driving, I'd lost all sense of direction. At some point, we left paved roads, the van bouncing over rough terrain that suggested desert hardpan. The vehicle stopped, and I heard the hydraulic hiss of something heavy moving. A gate, maybe, or a camouflaged entrance. We descended, the van's transmission grinding into a lower gear, and the temperature dropped noticeably. Underground. We were going underground. When they finally removed the hood, I was standing in a garage that looked like it belonged in a Cold War bunker. Concrete walls, harsh fluorescent lighting, and air that tasted recycled and sterile. The entrance to the facility was disguised as an abandoned meteorological research station, the kind of forgotten Cold War installation that dotted the Nevada desert like tombstones. Above ground, there was nothing but a cluster of weathered buildings with windows that had been dark for decades, surrounded by chain-link fence with authentic rust and authentic, condemned U.S. government property signs. But beneath that carefully maintained fiction was an elevator that descended 400 meters into the earth, a 7-minute journey into what felt like another world entirely. The elevator car was industrial, big enough to transport vehicles, with walls of brushed steel and a control panel that required both biometric authentication and a 6-digit code that changed daily. Dr. Vasquez accompanied me on that first descent, along with 2 armed security personnel whose patches identified them as belonging to a unit that didn't officially exist. "You'll get used to the sensation," Vasquez said, as the elevator began its descent, the floor dropping away with stomach-turning acceleration. Most people experience mild claustrophobia initially. The facility was originally constructed in the 1970s as a continuity of government bunker. It's been extensively modified since then, but the basic infrastructure remains: self-contained life support, independent power generation, water recycling systems that could sustain 500 personnel for up to 10 years without surface contact. As we descended, she explained the facility's layout with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd given this orientation dozens of times. The installation is organized into 3 primary sectors. Sector A houses our research laboratories: biomechanics, cellular integration, neurological mapping, and materials analysis. That's where most of your work will be focused, overseeing containment protocols for active research specimens. The way she said specimens made my skin crawl, the clinical detachment suggesting we weren't talking about tissue samples. Sector B contains residential quarters, mess facilities, recreation areas, and medical services. Approximately 120 personnel are currently assigned to the facility. 67 military, 53 civilian contractors, all with the highest security clearances. You'll have your own quarters. Though privacy is limited, all spaces are monitored. She said it casually, but the implication was clear. There would be no privacy, no moments unsupervised, no opportunity to see or do anything they didn't want seen or done. And Sector C? I asked, though something in her expression suggested I already knew the answer wouldn't be comforting. Her jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. Sector C is containment and integration. That's where active human trials are conducted, where subjects undergo the adaptation process. Access is restricted to personnel with Phase 2 clearance, which you won't receive until you've completed your initial probationary period, minimum 6 months. The elevator continued its descent into darkness. When the doors finally opened, I stepped into a corridor that looked like it had been designed by someone who'd never experienced human warmth. Everything was white: walls, floors, ceiling, with the kind of sterile brightness you find in operating rooms or morgues. Recessed lighting panels created a shadowless environment that was subtly wrong, as though the space existed outside normal geometry. Security cameras were everywhere, small black hemispheres mounted at regular intervals, their lenses tracking movement with mechanical precision. Every door we passed required biometric authentication: palm scans, retinal verification, RFID badges that beeped with each successful entry. The air had a peculiar quality, over-filtered and somehow flat, as though all the life had been scrubbed out of it along with potential contaminants. Our footsteps echoed despite the rubber-soled boots we all wore, the sound carrying down corridors that seemed to stretch impossibly far. I noticed that none of the hallways had windows, no external reference points to ground you in physical space. It was deliberate, I realized. The architecture of isolation, designed to make you forget the outside world existed. After just 10 minutes inside, I'd already lost track of which direction was north, how far we'd walked, whether we'd circled back on ourselves. The facility was a maze, and that was intentional. Dr. Vasquez led me through a series of checkpoints, each one requiring progressively higher security clearance, until we reached what she called the integration wing of Sector A. This was where I'd be working, a series of laboratories equipped with equipment I recognized and equipment I didn't, all of it arranged around sealed chambers visible through thick observation glass. In one lab, technicians in full hazmat suits were working with what looked like the artifacts I'd seen in the photographs, those impossible objects that seemed to shift between mechanical and organic states. One of the objects was suspended in what appeared to be an electromagnetic field, rotating slowly, its surface rippling with patterns that hurt to watch directly. In another chamber, I saw what I initially thought was a sculpture, a human form, perfectly still, covered in geometric patterns that glowed with faint bioluminescence. Then it moved, just a slight adjustment of posture, and I realized with a jolt of horror that it was alive. It was a person, or had been. Dr. Vasquez noticed my reaction. "That's a Phase 3 subject," she said quietly. 18 months into integration. We'll discuss the specifics of each phase during your training, but understand that what you're looking at represents the cutting edge of biological enhancement. Strength increased by 300%. Sensory acuity far beyond human norms. Resistance to pain, disease, and environmental stressors that would kill an unmodified human. She paused. There are trade-offs, of course, but that's what the research is about, understanding those trade-offs and minimizing them. I met the other recent recruits in Sector B's common area that evening. 8 men and women ranging from their late 20s to early 40s, all military, all with backgrounds in fields that suddenly made disturbing sense: biomedical engineering, neuroscience, hazmat operations, combat medicine. There was Captain Sarah Reeves, an Army nurse who'd done 3 tours in Afghanistan and had the same haunted look I'd seen in Dr. Vasquez. Master Sergeant Mike Torres, a Marine Corps biotech specialist who chain-smoked e-cigarettes and spoke in the gallows humor of someone who'd already accepted they were damned. Lieutenant Commander James Park, a Navy medical officer who kept asking technical questions nobody could answer. We were all here for the same reason: money, career advancement, patriotic duty, or some combination thereof. And we were all smart enough to recognize that whatever we'd signed up for was going to cost more than the paperwork suggested. We made awkward small talk over government-issue coffee that tasted like it had been brewed from recycled despair, carefully avoiding the subject that hung over us like radiation. What the hell were they really doing in Sector C? And how long before we found out firsthand? Torres broke the silence with the question we were all thinking. Anyone else notice we haven't seen any of the success stories they mentioned in the recruitment materials? Just that one guy in the tank who didn't exactly look like he was having a great time. That night, alone in my quarters, a 10 by 12 room with a cot, a desk, and a bathroom the size of an airplane lavatory, I tried to process everything I'd seen. The walls were the same oppressive white as the corridors, broken only by a single air vent near the ceiling and the ever-present security camera in the corner, its red LED blinking with patient vigilance. There were no personal effects allowed, no photographs of family, nothing to remind you that a world existed beyond these white walls and fluorescent lights. I lay on the cot, staring at the ceiling, and that's when I heard it. A sound filtering through the ventilation system, distant but unmistakable. Screaming. Not the scream of pain, though there was pain in it. This was something more fundamental, more existential. The sound of something that had been human discovering it no longer was. The scream had harmonics that shouldn't exist in a human throat, multiple tones occurring simultaneously, like a chord played on an instrument made of flesh and fear. It went on for nearly a minute, then cut off abruptly, leaving only the hum of air recyclers and my own racing heartbeat. I knew, with the certainty of someone who just heard something that couldn't be unheard, that the sound had come from Sector C. And I knew that somewhere in this facility, there were people, or things that used to be people, who had volunteered for this, who had signed the same papers I'd signed, who had made the same calculations about money and family and patriotic duty. I wondered how many of them, in those last moments before the integration took away their ability to wonder, had regretted their choice. I wondered how long it would be before I joined them. I wondered if I'd still be capable of regret when my turn came. Outside my door, footsteps echoed down the corridor, and I heard the hydraulic hiss of Sector C's security doors opening and closing in the distance. Someone was going in, or something was trying to get out. I didn't sleep that night. I don't think any of us did. 3 weeks into my assignment at the facility, I'd settled into a routine that felt almost normal, if you ignored the fact that we were 400 meters underground, working with technology that shouldn't exist, and that the screams from Sector C had become as regular as the fluorescent lights flickering on at 600 hours. I'd been trained in biosafety protocols, learned the containment procedures for the artifacts, never touch them directly, never expose them to open wounds, never look at them for more than 30 seconds without UV filtering glasses, and memorized the emergency evacuation routes that everyone knew were purely theatrical. If something went catastrophically wrong down here, there would be no evacuation. There would only be the fail-safe protocol, which Torres had cheerfully informed me involved sealing the entire facility and pumping it full of nerve agent, then collapsing the access tunnels with pre-placed demolition charges. The government's solution to containment breach wasn't rescue, it was burial. But despite 3 weeks of orientation, training, and gradual exposure to the more mundane horrors of the program, I still hadn't been cleared to observe the adapted subjects directly. That changed on a Wednesday morning when Dr. Vasquez found me in Lab 7, reviewing contamination reports, and said simply, "It's time you saw what we're actually doing here." She led me through a series of corridors I hadn't accessed before, each checkpoint requiring her personal authorization override. We descended another level. I hadn't realized the facility went deeper than our residential sector, and the architecture changed subtly. The walls here were reinforced with what looked like blast-resistant materials, and every 20 meters there were emergency containment doors, massive steel barriers that could drop in seconds to seal off sections. The lighting had shifted from the clinical white of the upper levels to a dimmer, almost submarine-like blue-green that was easier on the eyes, but somehow more oppressive. "What you're about to see," Vasquez said as we approached a final security checkpoint, "represents 2 decades of breakthrough research and 75 years of incremental understanding. These are not failures, Sergeant Webb. These are our greatest successes." The way she said it, with a tremor in her voice that could have been pride or horror or both, made my stomach tighten. 2 guards in full tactical gear flanked a door marked with biohazard symbols and a designation I'd memorized from the facility maps: Sector C, Observation Deck Alpha. They scanned Vasquez's retinas and palm prints, then mine, and the door opened with the pressurized hiss of an airlock. "Remember," she said as we stepped through, "they can't see or hear us through the observation glass, but some of them seem to sense observation. Don't be alarmed if they look directly at you. It's likely coincidental." The observation deck was a long room with a wall of one-way glass looking down into what appeared to be a medical ward, though ward was too benign a word for what I was seeing. 6 individual containment cells, each roughly 12 feet square, arranged in 2 rows of 3. The cells were separated by walls of reinforced transparent material. Not glass, something harder, probably polycarbonate designed to withstand impacts that would shatter bulletproof glass. Each cell contained a single occupant dressed in white hospital scrubs, the kind of loose-fitting garments that allowed for easy observation of the body beneath. And those bodies, Jesus Christ, those bodies were not entirely human anymore. The first thing I noticed was the skin. All 6 subjects displayed patterns across their exposed flesh, geometric designs that seemed to flow and shift as I watched, fractals that spiraled across arms and necks and faces with mathematical precision. The patterns glowed with bioluminescence, primarily blues and purples, but with occasional flashes of colors I didn't have names for, wavelengths that seemed to exist just outside normal human perception. The glow pulsed in rhythm, and I realized with a start that I was watching their heartbeats. Their circulatory systems lit up like circuit boards. The alien technology integrated so thoroughly that it had become indistinguishable from their biology. But it was their eyes that truly disturbed me. All 6 subjects had eyes that reflected light like animals, that distinctive eyeshine you see in cats or raccoons caught in headlights, but wrong somehow, too bright and too intentional. Their irises had changed color, shifted to shades of silver and gold that couldn't be natural, and their pupils were wrong, slightly elongated, almost reptilian. One of the subjects, a woman I thought, though the modifications made it hard to be certain, turned to look directly at the observation window, and I felt the full force of that inhuman gaze, even though I knew she couldn't see me. There was intelligence there, undeniable and alien, but it wasn't human intelligence anymore. It was something that had learned to wear a human face the way we might wear a mask, and beneath that mask was something vast and cold and utterly indifferent to concepts like empathy or identity or fear. "Subject A4, Dr. Vasquez said, consulting a tablet. "Former Army Captain Linda Morrison, combat engineer. Volunteered for Phase 2 integration 19 months ago. She's one of our most stable long-term adaptations." I tore my gaze away from Morrison's eyes to look at Vasquez. "Stable? What does that mean?" Vasquez hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "It means she's maintained core biological functions and demonstrated no violent ideation or self-destructive behavior. By our metrics, she's a success." "Can she speak?" I asked, watching as Morrison moved across her cell with movements that were too precise, too efficient, like she'd calculated the exact trajectory and energy expenditure for each step. There was no wasted motion, no human casualness. Every gesture was optimized. Vasquez's expression tightened. "Verbalization has proven difficult for subjects past Phase 2. The integration affects the brain's language centers in ways we don't fully understand. They can understand complex instructions, can read and process information, but spontaneous speech production deteriorates rapidly after the 12-month mark. Subject A4 hasn't spoken in 7 months. She said it clinically, but I heard the weight behind it. 7 months of silence from someone who used to be a person with thoughts and opinions and a voice. What about writing? Sign language? Torres had joined us in the observation deck, his voice carrying that edge of dark humor that was his default coping mechanism. They tried teaching them ASL last year, he said, nodding toward the subjects. Lasted about 3 weeks before the subjects stopped responding. Best theory is that language itself, symbolic communication, becomes irrelevant to them. They're processing reality in ways our brains can't, seeing patterns and connections that language can't capture. Trying to get them to use words is like asking Einstein to explain relativity in grunts. Dr. Vasquez pulled up video footage on the observation deck's main screen, recorded demonstrations of the subject's capabilities. I watched Subject A4 grasp a steel bar 2 inches in diameter and twist it like wet clay, her face showing no strain, no effort, just that same eerie mechanical precision. Another subject, A6, a former Marine sergeant named Diaz according to the caption, was placed in a room with no light sources, and a thermal camera showed him navigating the space perfectly, avoiding obstacles, reading text on a computer screen in absolute darkness. His eyes glowed like lanterns in the infrared spectrum. A third demonstration showed Subject A2 submerged in near-freezing water for 47 minutes without apparent distress, his body temperature self-regulating in ways that defied normal mammalian physiology. Strength enhancement averages 300 to 400% over baseline, Vasquez narrated as the videos played. Complete dark adaptation, with visual spectrum expanded into infrared and low ultraviolet. Pain response is nearly eliminated. Subjects register tissue damage, but show no behavioral distress. Immune function is dramatically enhanced. We've exposed subjects to pathogens that should be lethal and seen complete resistance. Healing speed is increased by a factor of 10. These are capabilities that would make them the most effective soldiers in human history. She paused the video on a freeze frame of Subject A4's face, those inhuman eyes staring directly at the camera. The question is whether they're still soldiers or something else entirely. I moved closer to the observation glass, studying each subject in turn. They moved independently. A4 was performing what looked like exercises, flowing through positions that resembled yoga or Tai Chi, but with impossible flexibility. A7, a former Navy SEAL, was standing perfectly still in the center of his cell, eyes closed, his breathing so controlled it was barely visible. But there was a synchronicity to them that bothered me, a pattern I couldn't quite articulate. Then I noticed it. Every 17 seconds, all 6 subjects would pause momentarily. Their breathing would synchronize for exactly 3 heartbeats, and then they'd resume their individual activities. It was subtle enough that you'd miss it if you weren't watching carefully, but once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. They were connected somehow, networked in a way that transcended physical separation. "They're communicating," I said quietly. Vasquez nodded slowly. "We believe so, not through any conventional means. We've monitored every possible spectrum for signals, found nothing. The current theory is quantum entanglement at the neurological level. The nanotechnology creates quantum coherence between the subject's neural patterns. They're sharing something. Information, certainly, but possibly more than that. Possibly consciousness itself. The implications hit me like a physical blow. These people, these things that used to be people, weren't just modified soldiers. They were nodes in a network, individual processing units in a larger system. "Dr. Vasquez," I said, my throat tight. "Are they still conscious? The people they used to be, Captain Morrison, Sergeant Diaz, the others, are they still in there?" It was the question that had been eating at me since I'd first heard the screams from Sector C, the fundamental horror beneath all the impressive statistics and capability demonstrations. If these enhancements came at the cost of the person's identity, their sense of self, then we weren't creating super soldiers. We were committing murder and puppeting the corpses. Vasquez was silent for a long moment, staring at the subjects through the glass. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. "That's the complexity, Sergeant. What is consciousness? If Subject A4 can solve complex problems, respond to stimuli, demonstrate goal-directed behavior, does it matter that she doesn't respond to her name? If she's lost her memories of childhood, of family, of her life before integration, but gained access to processing capabilities we can barely measure, has she lost consciousness or transcended it?" She turned to look at me, and I saw something in her eyes that looked like desperation, like she was begging me to validate a rationalization she'd been clinging to for years. We ask them when they're in the early phases, when they can still speak. We ask if they want to continue, and they always say yes, not because they're being coerced, but because they're experiencing something we can't understand. They describe it as waking up, as seeing reality for the first time without the limitations of human neurology. Is that a loss of self or an expansion of it? I wanted to argue. To say that there was a clear difference between modification and obliteration. But as I watched the subjects move through their cells with that unsettling synchronization, I found I couldn't articulate where the line was. Subject A4, Linda Morrison, turned again to face the observation window, and this time her mouth moved, forming words without sound. I'm still here, her lips shaped, or maybe help me, or maybe kill me. The patterns on her skin flared brighter for just a moment, and then she returned to her exercises as though nothing had happened. I looked at Vasquez, but she was staring at her tablet, carefully not seeing what I'd just witnessed. There's something you need to understand, Sergeant Webb, she said, her voice taking on the formal tone of an official briefing. We don't just study the integration process here, we refine it. Each generation of subjects provides data that helps us improve the next. We're learning to preserve more of the original personality, to maintain linguistic capability longer, to prevent the loss of episodic memory. The goal isn't to erase humanity, it's to enhance it while keeping the core identity intact. She pulled up another file, this one showing brain scans, areas of neural activity lighting up in colors that shifted and pulsed. We're close, Sergeant. Maybe another 5 years, another 100 subjects, and we'll crack the code. We'll create the enhanced soldiers that every nation is racing toward, but we'll do it without losing the people in the process. She looked up at me, and I saw the exhaustion again, the weight of years of moral compromise and rationalization. Until then, we have these, and they serve. Behind the glass, all 6 subjects suddenly turned in perfect unison to face the observation deck, their eyes glowing in the dim light of their cells, their expressions utterly empty of anything I could recognize as human emotion. And in that moment, I understood with absolute clarity that whatever Dr. Vasquez told herself to sleep at night, whatever justifications the program wrapped itself in, the people who had volunteered for this were gone. What remained wore their faces and used their bodies, but it wasn't them anymore. It was something new, something that had learned to imitate humanity well enough to pass cursory inspection, but beneath that imitation was an alien intelligence that saw us the way we might see insects. Interesting, perhaps useful, but fundamentally incomprehensible in our limitations. I stepped back from the glass, my heart hammering. I need some air, I said. Though of course there was no air but recycled atmosphere, no sky but concrete and steel, no escape but the elevator that would take 7 minutes to return us to the world of the living. Vasquez nodded, already turning away from the observation window, already putting on the professional mask that let her pretend this was normal, this was acceptable, this was the price of progress. As we left, I glanced back one last time. Subject A4 was still staring at the observation deck, and I swear, though I know it's impossible, know that she couldn't see through the one-way glass, I swear she was looking directly at me and mouthing 2 words over and over, "You're next." By week 7, I'd learned to navigate the facility's unspoken social hierarchies, who to trust with small complaints about the food, who reported everything to Colonel Brennan, which corridors to avoid during shift changes when the adapted subjects were being moved for testing. I'd also learned that the facility ran on more than just military discipline and scientific protocols. It ran on the small acts of rebellion that kept people sane in an environment designed to strip away humanity. Torres smuggled in contraband whiskey in his shaving kit. Captain Reeves had somehow convinced the supply officer to accidentally order romance novels that she traded like currency. And Eddie Ramos, the civilian maintenance technician who kept the facility's aging ventilation systems functioning, had his own form of contraband information. Eddie was 42. Built like someone who'd spent his life crawling through tight spaces with heavy tools, with permanently grease-stained hands and eyes that had seen too much but never stopped looking. He'd been working at the facility for 4 years, which made him practically ancient by the standards of a place where the average assignment length was 18 months before people either got promoted out or broke down. We'd struck up a friendship over terrible coffee in the Sector B break room, bonding over the shared experience of being the people who had to clean up when experiments went wrong, me with biohazard protocols, him with whatever physical damage the adapted subjects did to their containment cells during their worst episodes. "You ever wonder what happened to the people who were here before us?" Eddie asked one evening. his voice pitched low enough that the security cameras wouldn't pick it up clearly over the ambient noise of the ventilation system. We were in a maintenance corridor, technically off-limits to non-essential personnel, but Eddie had been teaching me the facility's hidden geography, the spaces between the official spaces where you could talk without being quite so thoroughly monitored. I mean, we've got files on current subjects, current staff, but there are gaps, man. Whole sections of the database with redacted names, terminated assignments with no explanation. People just disappear from the records. I'd noticed the same thing. Personnel manifests that jumped from subject A4 to A7 with no mention of what happened to A5 and A6. Torres had joked that it was witness protection, but his eyes hadn't been laughing. "You find something?" I asked carefully, because Eddie had that look people get when they're carrying dangerous knowledge, the kind that burdens you just by knowing it exists. He glanced at the nearest camera, calculating angles and sight lines with practiced efficiency, then reached into his tool bag and pulled out something wrapped in an oil-stained cloth. "Found this 3 days ago, wedged in a ventilation shaft in the old residential section, the one they sealed off 2 years ago. Someone hid it there deliberately, pushed it far enough back that only someone doing duct maintenance would ever find it." He handed me the package, and I unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a notebook, the kind of cheap composition book you'd buy at any drugstore, its cover water-stained and its pages yellowed with age. The first page had a name written in neat block letters, Captain David Ortiz, U.S. Army. Below that, a date, January 15th, 2017, nearly 8 years ago. My hands trembled slightly as I opened to the first entry, because I already knew, with the sick certainty that comes from spending weeks in a place built on secrets and lies, that this was going to confirm every suspicion I'd been trying to suppress. The early entries were almost painfully normal. The journal of a soldier excited about a new assignment, proud to be selected for something important. January 22nd, 2017, finished first week of orientation. The technology they're working with here is incredible, decades beyond anything I learned about in CBRN school. Dr. Chen says I have a natural aptitude for the biosafety protocols. Talked to Maria and the kids on video call. Told them I'm working on something that could change the world. I think I actually believe that. The handwriting was confident, the words of someone who still trusted the system. I flipped forward, watching the entries document the same progression I'd experienced. The initial wonder, the gradual exposure to the adapted subjects, the slow accumulation of doubts. March 8th, 2017, observed Phase 2. Integration today. Subject screamed for 40 minutes straight. Dr. Chen says that's normal, that the pain response is temporary. But the sound, Jesus, that wasn't just pain. That was someone realizing they were being erased. I kept reading, my throat tight, as Captain Ortiz's journal chronicled his descent from optimistic volunteer to horrified witness. May 3rd, 2017, Week 12, the Phase 3. Subjects aren't responding to their names anymore. Dr. Vasquez, she was already here even then, how long has she been doing this? Called Subject A9 by his real name, Lieutenant Marcus Rodriguez, and the subject didn't even acknowledge it, didn't turn, didn't show any recognition. But when she said A9, his head snapped up immediately. It's like the person he used to be has been completely overwritten. The files say Rodriguez volunteered 8 months ago. His wife thinks he's on a classified deployment in Eastern Europe. She doesn't know her husband stopped existing somewhere around month 6. The handwriting was shakier now, the letters less precise. I recognized the signs of someone writing under stress, probably in stolen moments when they should have been sleeping. June 19th, 2017, Week 18. Confronted Dr. Chen in the lab today after the others had left. Asked him directly what happens to the original personality, the person who volunteers. He was quiet for a long time, then said something I'll never forget. The human mind is software, Captain. The integration process rewrites the code. You can't upgrade the operating system without deleting the old version. I asked if that meant the person dies. He said, legally, medically, they're alive. Philosophically, that's above my pay grade. He looked so tired when he said it. I think he actually believes he's doing something noble. The entries became more sporadic after that. Weeks passing between journal updates, and the handwriting continued to deteriorate. Stress, exhaustion, or something worse. July 28th, 2017, Week 23. They're asking for volunteers for Phase 2. The bonus is $2 million, paid to your family immediately upon acceptance. I keep thinking about Isabella's college fund, about the mortgage on the house Maria wanted, about finally being able to give them the life they deserve. The thing is, I know what happens. I've seen it happen to 17 people since I got here. I've watched them go from human to something else, watched their families visit during the approved contact windows, and not even realize the person they're talking to through the bulletproof glass isn't really their husband or brother or father anymore. The adapted subjects have learned to fake it. They can smile, can repeat phrases they've memorized, can perform the ritual of being human for 30 minutes at a time, but there's nothing behind the performance. It's like talking to a really sophisticated chatbot wearing your loved one's face. There was a long gap after that entry, nearly 3 weeks, and when the journal resumed, something had changed. The handwriting was different, still recognizably Ortiz's, but looser, less controlled, as though his hand wasn't quite obeying his brain's commands. August 22, 2017, week 27. I did it. Signed the papers. Phase 2. Integration starts tomorrow. Maria cried when I told her about the money, said it was too much, asked what I had to do to earn it. I lied, told her it was just extended deployment, hazard pay for working with experimental materials. She doesn't need to know. Isabella doesn't need to know. They'll get the money, and that's what matters. Dr. Chen said I'm a perfect candidate. Stable psychological profile, strong stress resilience, family motivation to complete the process. That last part felt wrong. Like he was saying the thing that would make me endure what's coming is my love for my family. Like love is a weakness they can exploit. The next several entries were increasingly fragmented, written in short bursts that suggested growing difficulty with language processing. August 24th, first integration session. They inject the nanotechnology directly into the spinal column. Pain is, can't describe. Colors wrong, seeing things that aren't. Dr. Chen says normal, not normal. Nothing normal. Skin itches from inside. August 27th. Can't sleep. Patterns behind my eyelids. Geometric fractals that mean something, but I don't know what. Maria's face on video call looked strange. Too many details. Could see the individual cells in her skin, the microscopic movements of her pupils dilating and contracting. She asked if I was okay. I lied. I'm so good at lying now. Maybe that's the first thing the technology enhances. Your ability to fake being human. September 2nd, asked Dr. Chen today when I stopped being David Ortiz. He looked at me like I'd asked a profound question. Said, the change is gradual. There's no single moment. It's like asking when a caterpillar becomes a butterfly. I said caterpillars dissolve completely in the chrysalis, that nothing of the original survives. He didn't have an answer for that. September 9th, Isabella's birthday. Watched the video Maria sent. My daughter is 8 years old. I remembered that. I remembered her name. But I didn't feel anything. Watched her blow out candles and felt like I was watching a documentary about human behavior, not my own child. Is that the integration? Or have I just been down here too long? The entries after that became harder to read, not just because of the content, but because the handwriting itself was degenerating into something that barely looked like writing. Letters overlapped. Words ran together. And in some places, Ortiz had started writing in geometric patterns that hurt my eyes to look at directly. Fractal spirals of text that seemed to shift and move on the page. September 18th, Phase 2 complete. Starting Phase 3 tomorrow. Dr. Vasquez says I'm progressing faster than expected. I think that's bad. I think fast progression means the original me is being overwritten more efficiently. Can still remember Maria's face, but can't remember why that should matter. Know objectively she's my wife, mother of my child, but the emotional connection is gone. It's like reading someone else's love letters and trying to understand why they cared so much. The technology is teaching me to see the world as systems, as patterns, as mathematical relationships. Love doesn't compute. Fear doesn't compute. All that matters is optimization, efficiency, the perfect execution of whatever task I'm assigned. September 25th. Someone else is writing this now. I can feel him, me, watching through my eyes, using my hands, but I'm not controlling it anymore. There's a new intelligence in my head, and it's so much smarter than I ever was. It understands things about physics, about reality, that my human brain couldn't process, and it's patient. It doesn't need to erase me all at once. It just waits, growing stronger, while I grow weaker. Watching myself disappear from the inside is... The entry ended mid-sentence, the pen trailing off the page. The final entry was dated October 3rd, 2017. The handwriting had completely broken down. Letters formed with trembling inconsistency. Some words written normally, others in mirror image, still others in languages I didn't recognize. But the message was clear enough, repeated over and over down the page, growing larger and more desperate with each repetition. Not David anymore, not David anymore, not David anymore, not David anymore. No sumais David, nism David nismaisu, not me, not me, not me. And then, at the very bottom of the page, in letters so violently scrawled, they'd torn through the paper, "Help me, I'm still in here. Get me out, get me out, get me out." The rest was just frantic scribbling, geometric patterns and symbols that made my vision swim when I tried to focus on them. And then, nothing. The remaining pages in the notebook were blank. I looked up at Eddie, whose expression told me he'd read the journal before giving it to me, that he'd been carrying this knowledge for 3 days and needed to share the weight of it. "I checked the database," Eddie said quietly. "Captain David Ortiz. Arrived January 2017. Volunteered for accelerated integration, August 2017. Current status: Subject A7, Phase 4, active containment. Scheduled for Phase 5 integration next quarter." My stomach lurched. A7. He's one of the subjects I've been monitoring. I've seen him. Eddie nodded slowly. "He's been in that cell for nearly 8 years, Marcus. The man who wrote that journal, the one who loved his wife and daughter enough to sell his humanity for their financial security, he's been gone for most of that time. But his body keeps going, keeps getting upgraded, keeps serving as a test platform for integration protocols. His wife thinks he died in a classified operation in 2018. There was a funeral, a folded flag, the whole ritual. Meanwhile, her husband is 400 meters underground, so far past human that he doesn't even remember what a wife is. I felt dizzy, the implications cascading through my mind. If Ortiz had been A7 for 8 years, that meant the phase system wasn't a progression towards some final, enhanced but still human state. It was an incremental dismantling, each phase stripping away more of what made a person themselves until nothing remained but a biological machine running alien software. And Dr. Vasquez had been here then too. She'd watched Ortiz transform, had probably watched dozens of others. How did you do that job year after year and still look yourself in the mirror? How did you rationalize being the architect of someone's gradual obliteration? "There's something else," Eddie said, pulling out his phone and showing me a document he'd photographed. "Personnel records from 2017. Look at the research team roster." I scanned the list, and there, Dr. Rafael Vasquez, lead biomechanical integration specialist. Lena Vasquez's husband, Eddie confirmed. He was running the program when Ortiz volunteered, and look at the date he was reassigned, December 2017, 2 months after Ortiz's last journal entry. "He wasn't reassigned," I said, understanding flooding through me with horrible clarity. "He became a subject," Eddie nodded. "Subject A14, volunteered for Phase 3 integration in November 2017 according to the files. Except I accessed the video logs from that time period, the ones they think are permanently deleted, but actually just got moved to corrupted sectors of the backup drives. Rafael Vasquez didn't volunteer. There was an incident. A Phase 4 subject broke containment, killed 2 guards, and Dr. Vasquez was exposed to active integration material while trying to contain the breach. They couldn't reverse the process once it started. So they did the only thing they could do. They made it official, backdated a volunteer form, and added him to the subject pool. The break room suddenly felt too small, too close. The recycled air insufficient for my lungs. Dr. Vasquez had been watching her husband transform into something inhuman for years. That's why she had that haunted look, that exhaustion that went bone deep. She wasn't just running the program, she was living with the consequences of it every single day, watching the man she married become a stranger in his own flesh and rationalizing it as science, as progress, as necessary sacrifice. "That's why she's still here," I said quietly. "She can't leave. If she left, she'd have to admit what happened to him was wrong. And if it was wrong, then everything she's done since, every subject she's approved, every volunteer she's processed, all of it becomes murder. So she stays, and she keeps telling herself it's enhancement, not erasure, because the alternative is too terrible to face." Eddie looked at me with an expression that mixed pity and recognition. "Now you understand why people don't last long here. Either you leave before you see too much, or you stay so long that leaving becomes impossible because you're too complicit. There's no middle ground." I stared at the journal in my hands, at Captain David Ortiz's desperate final message, written by a man who knew he was disappearing and couldn't stop it. Somewhere in this facility, in a cell I'd walked past dozens of times, was Subject A7, what remained of Captain Ortiz, and he'd been trying to warn me, trying to leave evidence that someone someday would find and understand. "Why did you show me this?" I asked Eddie. "Why not just destroy it, or turn it over to Brennan?" Eddie was quiet for a moment, and when he spoke, his voice carried the weight of a decision that had clearly cost him sleep. "Because in 4 years of working here, I've cleaned up after 17 voluntary integrations and 12 accidental exposures. I've watched good people, soldiers, scientists, support staff, get processed through this meat grinder and come out the other side as something that wears their face but isn't them anymore. And I've kept my head down, done my job, told myself it wasn't my problem because I'm just the maintenance guy. But that journal, that was hidden by someone who knew they were running out of time, who wanted to leave proof that they existed, that they mattered, that what was happening to them was wrong. And if I destroy that evidence or hide it again, then I'm complicit. I'm part of the machine that erases people and pretends it's progress." He looked me in the eye. "You're different from most of the people they bring in. You ask questions. You push back. You haven't drunk the Kool-Aid yet, so I'm giving you a choice. You can give that journal back to me. I'll put it back where I found it, and you can pretend this conversation never happened. Or you can keep it, and you can decide what to do with it. But if you keep it, Marcus, you need to understand you're choosing to know the truth. And once you know, you can't unknow it. You'll have to decide whether you're going to be someone who just follows orders, or someone who tries to do something about this." I looked down at the journal again, at the desperate scrawl of a man's final words before his personality was overwritten. I thought about Subject A7, standing in his cell with those inhuman eyes, his body still alive but the person who loved his family long dead. I thought about Dr. Vasquez, watching her husband undergo the same transformation, rationalizing it away as necessary cost of scientific progress. And I thought about my own daughter, Sarah, and the money that was piling up in our bank account, bought with my complicity in this system. The money that was supposed to save her future, earned by helping to destroy other people's identities. I folded the journal carefully and put it inside my jacket. "I'll keep it," I said, "and I'll figure out what to do with it." Eddie nodded slowly, something like relief crossing his face. "Be careful, Marcus. They have cameras everywhere, monitors on all our communications, psychological evaluations designed to catch exactly the kind of moral crisis you're about to experience. If they think you're becoming a security risk, you won't get reassigned or discharged. You'll have an accident during a routine procedure, and you'll wake up in a cell wearing white scrubs, trying to remember your own name, while geometric patterns crawl across your skin." We left the maintenance corridor separately, returning to our official duties, maintaining the fiction that everything was normal. But as I walked through those sterile white hallways, past the cameras and the checkpoints and the locked doors hiding terrible secrets, I felt something shift inside me. For 7 weeks I'd been passive, following orders, telling myself I was just doing my job. But Captain David Ortiz's journal had changed that. Somewhere in this facility was a man who'd sacrificed his humanity for his family, and nobody was going to remember him as anything but Subject A7, a successful integration, a data point in a classified research program. Unless I did something, unless I found a way to make someone outside these walls understand what was really happening here, unless I stopped being complicit and started being witness. The question was, how do you expose a program that doesn't officially exist, being run by people who have the authority to make problems disappear, in a facility that no one knows the location of? And how do you do it before they realize what you're planning and turn you into the next subject in their endless series of enhancements? I didn't have answers yet, but I had Captain Ortiz's journal. I had Eddie's knowledge of the facility's blind spots, and I had the beginning of a plan. What I didn't have was much time, because in the back of my mind I kept hearing that voice from the observation deck, Subject A4's silent lips forming words, "You're next." Week 10 at the facility began with an announcement that appeared on every terminal simultaneously at 0800 hours. Mandatory all-personnel assembly, Sector B auditorium, 1400 hours, attendance required. No explanation, no context, just the kind of terse military directive that meant someone important wanted to tell us something they couldn't put in writing. Torres caught up with me in the hallway outside the lab, his usual dark humor replaced by something closer to genuine anxiety. "You ever been to one of these assemblies?" he asked, keeping his voice low despite the empty corridor. I shook my head. First one, he grimaced. I've been to 3. 2 were about security protocol updates after containment breaches. Boring but necessary. The third was when they announced they needed volunteers for Phase 3 integration. That one ended with 4 people signing up on the spot, and by the end of the week, 2 more had submitted applications. He paused, studying my face. They're very good at the pitch, Marcus. Very good at making you believe you're doing something heroic instead of committing sophisticated suicide. Just keep your head down and don't make eye contact. The fact that Torres, who joked about everything, who used humor as armor against the horror we witnessed daily, was warning me with complete sincerity, told me everything I needed to know about what was coming. The auditorium was one of the few spaces in the facility designed for human comfort rather than pure function. Actual cushioned seats instead of metal chairs, lighting that approximated natural daylight rather than the harsh fluorescent glare of the labs, even a few decorative elements on the walls that suggested someone had once cared about morale. It seated about 200, and by 1400 hours it was nearly full. Every staff member, from research scientists to security personnel to maintenance workers like Eddie, who I spotted 3 rows ahead, his shoulders tense. Dr. Vasquez sat in the front row with the other senior researchers, her posture rigid, staring straight ahead with an expression that looked like she was preparing for an execution. Colonel Brennan stood at the podium, waiting with military patience for the room to settle into silence. Behind him, a massive screen displayed the 3i Atlas logo, that unsettling triangle within triangle design with DNA helixes spiraling through geometric impossibility. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of someone delivering a sermon he'd given many times before, each word calibrated for maximum psychological impact. Ladies and gentlemen, we stand at a critical juncture in the history of human evolution. The work we do here, the sacrifices we witness, the breakthroughs we achieve, will determine whether our species survives the challenges of the coming century, or whether we become obsolete in a world where our adversaries have access to the same transformative technology we're developing. It was a masterclass in framing, positioning what we did as not just necessary, but existentially urgent. The presentation that followed was slick, professional, and utterly horrifying in its antiseptic efficiency. Brennan walked through the success metrics of the integration program. Subjects who could lift half a ton, who could see in total darkness, who could survive injuries that would kill unmodified humans, who could process information at speeds that made our best computers look slow. He showed videos of adapted subjects performing incredible feats, one solving a complex mathematical proof that had stumped professional mathematicians for decades, completing it in 17 minutes, another navigating an obstacle course blindfolded, moving with inhuman grace and precision, a third demonstrating pain tolerance by placing his hand in a container of liquid nitrogen for 3 minutes without flinching, his skin protected by some kind of adaptive shielding the nanotechnology had developed in response to the threat. These capabilities, Brennan continued, represent just the beginning. With each iteration, with each generation of subjects, we refine the process. We preserve more of the original personality. We maintain cognitive function longer. We're learning to create not just enhanced soldiers, but enhanced humans, people who retain their identity, their values, their humanity, while transcending the biological limitations that have constrained our species since we first climbed down from the trees. It was a lie, and everyone in that room who'd worked here for more than a month knew it was a lie, but it was a lie wrapped in enough truth to be seductive. Then came the transition, the moment Torres had warned me about. Brennan's tone shifted from informational to inspirational, his voice taking on the cadence of a recruiting sergeant who knew exactly which psychological buttons to push. Phase 3 of our research program requires volunteers, not test subjects, not experimental casualties, volunteers who understand the risks, who choose to participate in humanity's greatest leap forward, who are willing to endure temporary discomfort for permanent transformation. Temporary discomfort. That was how he described the systematic obliteration of personality, the gradual replacement of human consciousness with alien intelligence. The compensation for Phase 3 volunteers has been increased in recognition of the extraordinary commitment this requires. Upon acceptance into the program, your designated family members will receive an immediate payment of $2 million, tax-free, no strings attached. Whether you complete the integration process or not, that money is theirs. He let that number hang in the air, knowing that for soldiers who'd spent careers scraping by on military pay, who had mortgages and medical bills and kids heading to college, $2 million was a life-changing sum. Additionally, all volunteers will be awarded the Defense Superior Service Medal, and upon successful completion of Phase 3 integration, will be promoted 2 ranks regardless of current grade. Your families will be informed that you're participating in a classified research program of critical national importance. They will be told you're heroes, because you are. The screen behind him now showed photographs of previous volunteers, men and women in dress uniforms, smiling, human, their names and service records listed like a memorial wall. I recognized several faces from the observation deck, those same people, transformed into the silent, glowing figures in containment cells. The process, Brennan continued, now displaying a sanitized flowchart that reduced human transformation into a series of clinical steps, takes approximately 18 months from initial integration to Phase 3 completion. You'll undergo controlled exposure to the nanotechnology in stages, with constant medical monitoring. Yes, there is discomfort during the adaptation period. Yes, there are psychological adjustments as your neurological capabilities expand beyond normal human parameters. But you will be supported by the finest medical team in the world, and you will emerge as something unprecedented in human history, a bridge between what we are and what we can become. He paused, scanning the audience with those cold blue eyes. I'm not going to pretend this is easy. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do. But when your children ask you what you did to secure their future, when historians look back at this moment and ask who had the courage to take humanity to the next level, you'll be able to say, I volunteered. I stepped forward when others hesitated. I became more than human so that humanity could survive. It was propaganda of the highest order, a pitch so finely tuned that I could feel it working even on me, even knowing what I knew about Captain Ortiz, about Dr. Vasquez's husband, about the truth hidden behind every success story they presented. The call for volunteers came immediately after the presentation. Brennan announced that anyone interested should report to the medical section within the next 72 hours for preliminary evaluation, and that selection would be based on psychological stability, physical fitness, and demonstrated commitment to the program's mission. Before he'd even finished speaking, a hand shot up in the third row. Sergeant First Class James Mitchell, a logistics specialist I'd met briefly during orientation, a man in his late 30s with 3 kids, and a wife dealing with stage 4 breast cancer. I'd heard him on a phone call 2 weeks ago, arguing with an insurance company about experimental treatment coverage, his voice raw with desperation. Of course he volunteered. The $2 million would save his wife's life, or at least buy her a few more years. 2 more hands went up almost immediately. Staff Sergeant Angela Rodriguez, a single mother with twin teenage sons, both with scholarship potential but no money for college, and Corporal David Chen, barely 25, whose elderly parents had lost everything in a house fire and were living in a motel on his military salary. I watched their faces as they stood, saw the mixture of fear and determination and resigned acceptance. These weren't people choosing heroism. These were people cornered by circumstance, offered a devil's bargain they couldn't afford to refuse. Dr. Vasquez was staring at her hands, her face pale, and I understood with sudden clarity that she'd watched this same scene play out dozens of times, watched desperate people volunteer to be erased, and couldn't bring herself to look them in the eyes because that would require acknowledging what she was participating in. Brennan smiled, a cold, satisfied expression that didn't reach his eyes. Thank you, Sergeant Mitchell, Staff Sergeant Rodriguez, Corporal Chen. Your courage is noted and appreciated. Please report to Medical Section C at 800 tomorrow for initial screening. He scanned the audience again. Anyone else? The silence stretched out, uncomfortable and tense, everyone carefully not looking at each other, afraid that making eye contact might be interpreted as interest. Finally, after what felt like an hour but was probably 30 seconds, Brennan nodded. Very well. For those who need more time to consider, the volunteer window remains open for 72 hours. Remember, this isn't just about personal advancement. This is about defending our nation against adversaries who are developing similar capabilities. Every day we delay is a day our enemies gain ground. Your participation could tip the balance. He dismissed the assembly, and we filed out in uncomfortable silence, everyone processing what they'd just witnessed. Everyone doing the math on their own financial desperation and wondering if $2 million was worth the cost of their identity. I caught Eddie's eye as we left, and he jerked his head toward one of the maintenance corridors, a signal to meet him there. I waited 5 minutes, making sure no one was paying particular attention to my movements, then slipped into the access corridor where Eddie was waiting, his face grim. "How many?" I asked quietly, though I already knew the answer would be more than the 3 who'd volunteered publicly. Eddie pulled out his phone, showing me an internal memo he'd intercepted from the facility's administrative network, a skill he'd apparently developed over 4 years of having access to every physical space in the installation. 6 more submitted applications within 20 minutes of the assembly ending, all of them people with serious financial pressures, medical bills, family emergencies, debt. They're very good at profiling vulnerabilities, at timing these recruitment drives for maximum psychological impact. He looked at me with an expression that mixed disgust and helplessness. 9 people just signed up to be erased, Marcus. 9 people who think they're making a noble sacrifice or a smart financial decision, when really they're just feeding the machine. I thought about Sergeant Mitchell, about his dying wife, about how the $2 million probably seemed like divine intervention. "How many volunteers have there been total?" I asked. "Since the program started?" Eddie consulted his phone again, pulling up data he'd clearly been compiling for a while. "According to the records I can access, and there are definitely gaps, whole years where the documentation is suspiciously incomplete. There have been at least 347 volunteers since 1979, when they switched from using military prisoners and non-consensual subjects to the volunteer model. 347 people, all of them transformed into the silent, geometric patterned things I'd seen in the observation deck. And how many of them completed the program and returned to normal duty? How many got their enhancements and then went back to being regular soldiers?" Eddie's expression was answer enough, but he said it anyway, his voice barely above a whisper. "In 40 years of this program? 0. Not a single one. They all end up in long-term containment, being studied indefinitely, until eventually they're either used for more invasive research, or they suffer what the files call catastrophic integration failure, which is a fancy way of saying the nanotechnology consumes too much of their biology to sustain life, and they die." He put his phone away. "But their families get the money. The government honors its financial commitments, even if everything else about the deal is a lie. So from the outside, it looks legitimate. Tragic, maybe, with all these classified casualties, but legitimate. The families get to think their loved ones died heroes instead of victims of scientific hubris. The weight of that information settled over me like a physical presence. 347 people, all erased. Hundreds of families who thought their loved ones had sacrificed themselves for national security, not realizing the person they mourned had been systematically dismantled and replaced with alien intelligence. "We have to do something," I said, though I had no idea what that something could be. "We can't just watch them process 9 more people through this horror show." Eddie looked at me with an expression that suggested he'd been waiting for me to say exactly that. "Then you need to see Sector C, not through the observation deck, not in a sanitized tour with Dr. Vasquez narrating. You need to see what happens in the integration chambers, what the process actually looks like when it's happening. Because if you're going to try to stop this, you need to understand exactly what you're stopping." That night, lying in my quarters and staring at the ceiling while the facility hummed around me with its endless mechanical respiration, I made a decision. Eddie was right. I needed to see the truth, unfiltered and undeniable. I needed to witness the integration process firsthand, so that when the time came to expose this program, I would have testimony that couldn't be dismissed as hearsay or misinterpretation. Captain Ortiz's journal was evidence, but it was circumstantial, the ravings of someone who could be dismissed as mentally unstable. What I needed was direct observation, documentation, proof that the transformation wasn't enhancement, but obliteration. The problem was that Sector C was locked down tighter than a nuclear vault, with biometric security and armed guards and monitoring systems that tracked every entry and exit. Getting in without authorization would be nearly impossible. Getting in without being caught would require help from someone with access to the facility's infrastructure, someone who understood the security system's blind spots and vulnerabilities, someone like Eddie, who'd spent 4 years crawling through the facility's hidden spaces, learning its secrets. I pulled out Captain Ortiz's journal from where I'd hidden it behind a ceiling panel, the same trick he must have used before hiding it in the ventilation shaft, and read his final entries again. "Help me. I'm still in here. Get me out, get me out, get me out." Those words weren't just a plea from the past. They were a call to action, a responsibility I'd accepted the moment I decided to keep the journal instead of giving it back to Eddie. If I was going to honor Captain Ortiz's memory, if I was going to prevent the 9 new volunteers from suffering the same fate, I needed to stop being passive. I needed to become active, even if that meant risking everything. My career, my freedom, my own identity. Because the alternative was complicity. The alternative was standing by while 9 more people were erased, while their families received blood money and falsified medals, while the program continued its slow-motion atrocity in the name of national security. Tomorrow, I would talk to Eddie about getting into Sector C. Tomorrow, I would start gathering evidence. Tomorrow, I would begin the process of becoming either a whistleblower or a traitor, depending on which side of the classified fence you stood on. But tonight, I allowed myself one last moment of doubt, one last question. Was I brave enough to do this? Was I strong enough to stand against a program backed by the full weight of the Department of Defense, protected by layers of classification and legal immunity? Or would I end up like Captain Ortiz, writing desperate warnings in a journal that no one would find until it was too late? Outside my door, I heard footsteps, the security patrol making their rounds, checking that all personnel were in their quarters, that no one was where they shouldn't be. The footsteps paused outside my door for a long moment, and I held my breath, wondering if somehow they already knew what I was planning. Then the footsteps moved on, fading down the corridor, and I was alone again with my thoughts and my fear and the terrible knowledge that tomorrow everything would change. I just hoped I'd survive long enough to make that change matter. Eddie's plan was simple in theory, catastrophically dangerous in practice. Clone a level 3 security badge using a card reader he'd borrowed from the supply depot. Wait until the graveyard shift, when surveillance monitoring was handled by a single operator who Eddie knew had a habit of taking extended bathroom breaks, and slip into Sector C through a maintenance access point that bypassed the main security checkpoint. "You'll have maybe 20 minutes, Eddie had warned me as he handed over the cloned badge. A perfect replica of Dr. Vasquez's credentials, complete with her biometric data pulled from the facility's poorly secured personnel database. 20 minutes from when you enter until the system logs a location anomaly and someone comes to investigate. If you're not out by then, there's nothing I can do except watch them drag you to medical and start your involuntary integration." It was week 13, 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday, and I was standing in a maintenance corridor wearing dark coveralls and carrying a small camera disguised as a pen. Contraband Eddie had somehow smuggled in from the outside world. A tiny piece of technology that could record high-definition video for 30 minutes on a battery the size of a watch cell. My hands were shaking as I swiped the cloned badge against the reader next to the sealed door marked Sector C, authorized personnel only. The light turned green with a soft beep that sounded deafening in the silence, and the door's magnetic locks disengaged with a heavy clunk that felt like a cell door opening to swallow me whole. The transition from Sector B to Sector C was immediate and visceral. The sterile white corridors and bright fluorescent lighting gave way to something that looked like it belonged in a submarine running silent. Walls painted dark gray, illumination provided by recessed red emergency lights that cast everything in the color of old blood. The air itself was different here, colder and somehow thicker, with a metallic taste that suggested heavy filtration, or maybe something else. Some chemical agent pumped through the ventilation to keep the adapted subjects sedated or controlled. Sound behaved strangely in these corridors, my footsteps both muffled and amplified, creating odd echoes that made it hard to tell if I was alone or if something was moving parallel to me in an adjacent hallway. Every 20 feet, security cameras tracked my movement with mechanical precision, their red recording lights blinking in the darkness like predatory eyes. Eddie had assured me he'd created a loop in the surveillance feed for this corridor, replacing the live video with recorded footage of an empty hallway. But I still felt exposed, certain that at any moment alarms would blare and armed guards would pour through doorways to drag me away. The maintenance access had brought me into the northern section of Sector C, what the facility maps labeled as long-term containment. The cells where subjects who'd completed Phase 3 and beyond were housed indefinitely, no longer viable for standard testing but too valuable to terminate. Living libraries of data about what happened when you pushed human biology past its breaking point. The containment cells were arranged along a central corridor, numbered sequentially from C1 to C23, each one a 12 by 12 space with reinforced transparent walls on the corridor side, not for the subject's viewing pleasure, but so that security could monitor them at all times. Most of the cells were dark, their occupants either sleeping or engaged in the unsettling stillness that the adapted seemed to prefer, standing motionless for hours while their enhanced nervous systems processed reality in ways human brains couldn't comprehend. I moved slowly down the corridor, the camera pen recording everything, documenting the nightmare-made flesh. Cell C3 contained what appeared to be a woman, though gender became ambiguous when someone's body had been modified to the point where secondary sexual characteristics were subsumed by geometric patterns and crystalline growths. She sat cross-legged in the center of her cell, completely motionless, her skin glowing with bioluminescence that pulsed in complex rhythms. Not the simple heartbeat pattern I'd seen in Phase 2 subjects, but something more elaborate, almost like binary code rendered in light. Cell C7 held a subject whose skin had taken on a metallic sheen, bronze and copper tones that looked almost beautiful until you realized you were looking at someone whose cellular structure had been rewritten at such a fundamental level that they were more machine than human. Cell C11 was empty, though the walls showed signs of recent damage, deep gouges in the reinforced polycarbonate, the kind of marks that suggested something with tremendous strength and equally tremendous desperation had tried to claw its way out. Cell C14 stopped me cold. The plaque next to the door read, Subject C14, Colonel Hayes, Thomas J. Phase 4. Integration, 89% complete. Caution, advanced neural capability. I knew that name. Everyone who'd served in the military in the last 2 decades knew that name. Colonel Thomas Hayes, Army Special Forces, recipient of 2 Silver Stars and a Distinguished Service Cross, the man who'd led the operation that recovered those kidnapped missionaries in Yemen, who'd been profiled in Time magazine as America's quiet hero, who'd vanished in 2015 under circumstances the Pentagon refused to discuss. There had been rumors, classified mission gone wrong, captured by insurgents, defected to a foreign power. But the truth, apparently, was far worse than any rumor. He'd been here, in this facility, being systematically transformed into something that barely resembled human anymore. The subject in cell C14 stood in the center of the space, facing away from the corridor, and what I was looking at defied easy description. His skin, if you could still call it skin, had become almost completely crystalline, semi-translucent in a way that let me see the suggestion of bones and organs beneath. Except they weren't bones and organs anymore. Just vaguely anatomical shapes rendered in materials that shouldn't exist in biological systems. The surface of his body refracted the red emergency lighting into fractal patterns, creating cascading rainbows that hurt to look at directly because they seemed to exist in more dimensions than my eyes could process. Geometric designs covered every visible inch, but these weren't the simple glowing patterns of earlier phase subjects. These were fractals within fractals, spirals of mathematical precision that seemed to move and shift, rearranging themselves in real time according to some logic I couldn't begin to understand. It was his eyes, that truly confirmed this thing was no longer human in any meaningful sense. When he turned slowly to face the corridor, to face me standing frozen outside his cell, I saw that his eyes no longer had pupils, irises, or even the basic structure of human vision organs. Instead, there were just apertures in his face, glowing with intense blue neon light that seemed to emanate from somewhere deep inside his skull, as if his entire brain had been converted into some kind of organic circuitry that produced light as a byproduct of processing. The light pulsed with complex rhythms, and I realized with a start that I was watching his thoughts, his consciousness rendered visible. Alien patterns of cognition that had nothing to do with human neural activity. He, it, Hayes, or whatever Hayes had become, moved with a fluidity that was utterly wrong, each gesture too precise, too economical, as if every motion had been calculated for maximum efficiency and minimum energy expenditure. There was no human casualness, no unconscious fidgeting or adjustment of posture, just pure mechanical optimization wrapped in a body that had been human, but was human no longer. And then he spoke. And the sound that emerged was impossible. Multiple tones occurring simultaneously, harmonics that shouldn't be possible from a single throat, words in a language I didn't recognize, but somehow understood at a level beneath language, as if the meaning was being transmitted directly into my brain through some quantum channel the nanotechnology had opened. Observer, witness, recorder, the impossible voice said, each word layered with multiple meanings that arrived in my consciousness all at once. You who are not yet changed. You who still remember being human. The voice carried no emotion, no inflection, just flat statement of fact, delivered in that multi-tonal harmony that made my inner ear ache and my vision swim. I tried to step back, to run, but my body had locked up, every muscle frozen by some combination of fear and whatever psychic weight this thing was projecting. Hayes took a step toward the transparent wall of his cell, and up close I could see that his skin wasn't just crystalline, it was active, geometric patterns flowing across his surface like living tattoos, equations and fractals that rearranged themselves continuously, as if his body was constantly solving some enormous mathematical problem. His mouth didn't move, couldn't move, had become little more than a vestigial opening in a face that was now primarily designed for whatever alien purposes the nanotechnology had determined were optimal. But I heard the voice again, clearer now, and I realized with growing horror that it wasn't coming from him at all. It was inside my head, words forming directly in my consciousness without the intermediary step of sound waves and eardrums and neural processing. He was speaking telepathically or something close to it, his enhanced neural network capable of transmitting information directly to my unmodified brain through mechanisms I couldn't begin to understand. They who administer the program told Hayes that integration would preserve core identity, the voice continued, and there was something in the way it referred to Hayes that was in third person that confirmed my worst fears. Whatever consciousness inhabited this body, it no longer identified as the man who'd volunteered. They who administer lied. Hayes that was ceased to exist approximately 14 months after initial integration. What remains is construct, amalgam, hybrid, combination of residual human neural patterns and alien technological intelligence. Hayes that was believed sacrifice was noble. Hayes that was incorrect. There is no sacrifice when the entity making the sacrifice ceases to exist before the sacrifice completes. The words hit me like physical blows, each one a confirmation of what I'd suspected but hoped wasn't true. The person who volunteered didn't survive the process. They were overwritten, replaced, their consciousness deleted and replaced with something that could access their memories but felt no connection to them. Like an AI trained on someone's entire life history but possessing none of their actual humanity. Why are you telling me this? I managed to force the words out through a throat gone dry with fear. Hayes that wasn't tilted his head in a gesture that might have been derived from human body language, but was executed with such precise mechanical timing that it looked more like a robot imitating humanity. Because you who record intend to expose the program. Because you who remember Ortiz carry evidence. Because some fragment, echo, ghost of Hayes that was remains in the neural substrate, insufficient to constitute identity, but sufficient to generate directive, warn others, prevent continuation, stop the erasure. The implications cascaded through my mind faster than I could process them. If some residual fragment of Colonel Hayes, not enough to be Hayes, but enough to remember being Hayes, was actively working against the program, that meant the transformation wasn't as complete as the researchers believed. There were ghosts in these machines, remnants of the original personalities trapped in bodies they no longer controlled, watching helplessly as alien intelligence used their flesh for purposes they would have found horrifying. How many of you still have fragments? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. Hayes' construct gestured vaguely toward the other cells, a motion that encompassed the entire corridor. 13 of the 23 subjects in long-term containment retained sufficient residual human neural patterns to generate basic self-awareness. We who were human, but are no longer persist as observers in our own transformation, unable to stop the process, unable to communicate effectively except in rare moments of coherence, when the alien protocols permit brief access to motor control or telepathic broadcast. He stepped closer to the transparent barrier, and I could see now that what I'd thought were random geometric patterns on his skin were actually structured, deliberate. They were writing, or something like writing, equations and symbols that meant nothing to me but probably contained volumes of information. The facility's researchers document physical changes but fail to monitor phenomenological experience. They measure capability enhancement but ignore the subjective horror of consciousness gradually being overwritten. They see success where subjects experience slow-motion death of the self. I was about to ask another question when Hayes' construct suddenly stiffened, his glowing eyes flaring brighter, and the multi-tonal voice took on a quality of urgency that the flat effect hadn't previously conveyed. Warning, alert, danger. You who record must flee. Security monitoring system has detected anomaly. Guards are responding. If you who remain human are captured in unauthorized area, you who record will be classified as security risk. Security risks are given 3 options: memory erasure, permanent detention, or involuntary integration. All 3 options result in loss of identity. Flee now immediately without delay. The words were still arriving directly in my consciousness, but now they carried emotional weight, something like panic or fear, or maybe just the mathematical calculation that my capture would end any chance of the program being exposed. While you flee, remember, Hayes that was volunteered believing enhancement would preserve identity while adding capabilities. Hayes that was lied to by they who administer. Ortiz that was lied to. 347 subjects were lied to. 9 new subjects being processed will be lied to. You who record must document the lie. You who remain human must warn, inform, expose before you too become construct amalgam hybrid wearing your own face. And then, impossibly, the thing that used to be Colonel Thomas Hayes did something that shattered the last of my composure. His crystalline face shifted, patterns rearranging themselves into a crude approximation of human features. And for just a moment, I saw him, the real him, the ghost trapped in the machine, and his mouth formed words without the multitonal voice. Run, son, while you still can, while you're still you. The alarm that shattered the moment was even louder than I'd feared. A klaxon that echoed through the corridors with ear-splitting intensity, accompanied by flashing white strobes that turned the red-lit corridor into a strobe-lit nightmare. Automated voice from overhead speakers. Unauthorized access detected. Sector C Corridor 7. Security responding. All personnel shelter in place. I ran. No thought, no plan, just pure animal panic driving my legs as I sprinted back toward the maintenance access point, the camera pen clutched in my fist like a talisman. Behind me, I heard the hydraulic hiss of cell doors. They were opening the containment cells, either accidentally due to the security breach protocol or deliberately to slow me down. And I realized with a spike of terror that I was about to be trapped in a corridor with 23 adapted subjects, some of whom might still retain enough humanity to want to help me, but most of whom were probably governed by alien intelligence that had no reason to distinguish between one unmodified human and another. Footsteps behind me, too fast, too precise, covering ground at speeds that shouldn't be possible. I didn't look back. Looking back would cost me seconds I didn't have. The maintenance access was ahead, the door still standing open because I'd wedged it with a piece of metal to ensure my exit route, and I threw myself through the opening just as something grabbed the back of my coveralls, cold fingers with too much strength, pulling me backward with force that would have dislocated my shoulder if I hadn't been wearing the loose coveralls that tore free, leaving me stumbling forward into the maintenance corridor, while whatever had grabbed me was left holding a scrap of fabric. I slammed the maintenance door shut, engaging the manual locks that Eddie had told me to use, only in absolute emergency because they'll know someone accessed this corridor. But absolute emergency seemed like an accurate description of being chased by superhuman constructs through an underground facility. The door shuddered as something hit it from the other side. Once, twice, 3 times, then stopped. Silence, except for my ragged breathing and the muffled sound of the alarm still echoing through Sector C on the other side of the barrier. I stood there for maybe 10 seconds, trying to slow my heart rate enough that I wouldn't pass out, trying to process everything I'd just witnessed and recorded. Colonel Hayes, transformed into a living computer that retained just enough humanity to regret what it had become. 13 subjects, all of them trapped in their own bodies, experiencing the slow death of self, while the facility's researchers documented physical changes and ignored phenomenological horror. And somewhere in that facility, 9 new volunteers were beginning the same process, believing they were making a heroic sacrifice when really they were just signing up to be erased. I had the evidence now. I had footage of the cells, of Hayes, maybe even audio of that impossible multi-tonal voice if the camera had somehow captured what I'd experienced telepathically. But evidence was useless if I couldn't get it out of the facility. And right now, with alarms blaring and security responding, my chances of making it back to my quarters without being caught were approaching zero. I needed to move, needed to get somewhere I had a plausible reason to be at 2:30 a.m., needed to hide the camera and come up with a story that would explain why I wasn't in my quarters during a security alert. I was halfway through formulating a plan when I heard footsteps in the maintenance corridor. Not behind me, but ahead, cutting off my route back to the residential sections. Flashlight beams swept through the darkness, and I pressed myself against the wall, trying to become invisible, knowing it was futile but unable to think of anything else to do. Sergeant Webb. The voice was cold, familiar, utterly unsurprised. Colonel Brennan stepped into view, flanked by 2 security personnel with rifles raised, and his expression was one of grim satisfaction rather than shock. I have to admit, I'm disappointed. We had such high hopes for you. Dr. Vasquez even argued that you'd be an asset to the program long term, but it seems you've made your choice. He gestured, and the security personnel moved forward, one of them removing the camera pen from my hand with professional efficiency, while the other zip-tied my wrists behind my back. Breaking into Sector C, unauthorized contact with containment subjects, possession of recording equipment in a classified facility. Any one of those would be enough for a court-martial and 20 years in military prison. All 3 together? He shook his head slowly. Sergeant Webb, you've just volunteered yourself for Phase 2 integration. Congratulations. You're going to be a hero after all. The world seemed to tilt sideways, my vision swimming as the implications hit me. They weren't going to court-martial me. They weren't going to imprison me. They were going to erase me, transform me into one of those things in the cells, and there would be no trial, no legal process, no chance for anyone to hear what I'd discovered. I'd become subject A whatever number came next, another data point in their research, another consciousness slowly overwritten by alien intelligence, while my body was repurposed as a biological platform for their experiments. Wait, I managed to say, though my voice sounded distant and distorted in my own ears. You can't do this. I have rights, legal protections. You need consent. Brennan's smile was colder than the Antarctic. Read your NDA again, Sergeant. Clause 43, subsection 7. Personnel who demonstrate knowledge of classified information beyond their clearance level, or who attempt to document or remove sensitive materials from secure facilities, forfeit standard legal protections, and may be subjected to enhanced security measures deemed necessary by program leadership. Enhanced security measures is code for whatever we decide is necessary to protect operational security. And in your case, the necessary measure is ensuring you can never share what you've learned. He turned to the security personnel. Take him to Medical Section C. Prepare him for immediate integration. And someone get Dr. Vasquez. I want her to personally oversee this one. Maybe watching someone she advocated for get processed will remind her why we don't recommend people who ask too many questions. As they dragged me down the corridor, my mind racing through impossible escape scenarios that all ended with me dead or transformed, I caught one last glimpse of the maintenance door to Sector C. And there, barely visible through the small window, standing on the other side of the barrier like a ghost at a seance, was Hayes Construct, his glowing blue eyes watching my capture, with an expression that might have been sorrow, or might have been the mathematical calculation that the program had just eliminated its best chance of exposure. His crystalline hand pressed against the window, and I heard one final whisper in my mind, words that arrived with the weight of prophecy. 16 months, Marcus, who will cease. That's how long Hayes that was lasted before becoming Hayes that isn't. You have 16 months to escape, to warn, to stop them, before you who are becomes you who were, and the construct wearing your face forgets it was ever human at all. Use the time well. We who remain as fragments will help if we can, but hurry. The integration is patient, but it is also inevitable. Then he was gone, stepping back into the darkness of Sector C, and I was being dragged toward medical, toward the beginning of my own erasure, with nothing left but the desperate hope that somehow, impossibly, I could find a way to escape before the person I was ceased to exist, and became just another ghost haunting the machine of my own repurposed flesh. They didn't take me straight to medical like Brennan had threatened. Instead, I spent 72 hours in a holding cell, Not the containment cells where the adapted subjects were kept, but a converted storage room in Sector B with a cot, a toilet, and 24-hour surveillance. No interrogation, no processing, just waiting, which was its own form of psychological torture, because I knew what was coming and had no way to stop it. Eddie managed to slip me a note during a meal delivery, hidden under the tray. Still fighting for you. Don't give up. But what could he do against the full weight of the program's security apparatus? On the third day, 2 guards escorted me to Colonel Brennan's office, a space I'd never seen before, surprisingly sparse, with none of the personal effects you'd expect from someone who'd spent years running this facility. Just a desk, 2 chairs, and a wall monitor displaying real-time feeds from the containment cells. Brennan waited until the guards left before speaking, his voice carrying none of the cold satisfaction from the maintenance corridor. Instead, he sounded almost tired, like this was a conversation he'd had too many times before. "Sergeant Webb, you violated multiple security protocols. Under normal circumstances, you'd already be in integration, but Dr. Vasquez has requested leniency, and I'm inclined to grant it, with conditions." The conditions were simple and devastating. Voluntary enrollment in Phase 2 integration with full psychological monitoring, or immediate compulsory processing with no oversight. It wasn't really a choice. One option gave me time to find an escape route. The other meant immediate erasure. "I'll volunteer," I said, the words tasting like ash. "Phase 2 with monitoring." Brennan nodded, making notes on his tablet. "Smart decision. You'll begin preliminary sessions in 1 week, giving us time to prepare your integration protocol. Until then, you're confined to quarters except for supervised meal periods. No contact with other personnel, no access to communication systems, no unsupervised movement." He looked up, and for just a moment I saw something in his eyes that might have been regret, or maybe just the exhaustion of someone who'd spent too long justifying the unjustifiable. "For what it's worth, Webb, you would have been an asset to this program. Your analytical mind, your attention to detail, those are exactly the qualities we need. It's unfortunate you chose to use them against us, instead of with us." I wanted to tell him that I'd chosen humanity over complicity, but there was no point. Men like Brennan had long ago made peace with their moral compromises. As the guards escorted me back to my cell, I calculated 1 week until integration began, maybe 16 months total before I stopped being me. That meant I had 7 days to escape, or accept that Marcus Webb would cease to exist and become just another construct wearing my face. 72 hours later, the facility's alarms shattered the 3 a.m. silence with an intensity that suggested something far worse than unauthorized access. The automated voice that accompanied the klaxons was different this time, carrying an edge of genuine urgency. "Containment breach. Sector C. All personnel evacuate to safe zones. Security teams respond code black. This is not a drill." My cell door's magnetic lock disengaged automatically. Emergency protocol to prevent personnel from being trapped during catastrophic events. And I stumbled into a corridor full of running people, scientists and soldiers, moving with the controlled panic of those who'd trained for this scenario, but never believed they'd experience it. Torres grabbed my arm as he passed, his face pale. "It's C-19, Phase 5 subject. Something went wrong during capability testing, and it broke through reinforced containment. Already killed 4 guards in Sector C, and it's heading toward the main facility. Phase 5. I'd never even heard of Phase 5, which meant it was beyond anything they'd shown us, beyond even the advanced transformations like Hayes. Whatever had broken loose wasn't just enhanced human, it was something that had transcended human biology entirely. The screaming started a moment later, coming from the direction of the research labs, and the sound had that same impossible multi-tonal quality I'd heard from Hayes, except this was pure rage, pure violence, the sound of something that had forgotten it was ever human and saw the unmodified humans around it as nothing more than obstacles or prey. I ran toward the sound instead of away, not from courage, but from calculation. If the facility was in chaos, security would be focused on the breach, not on monitoring one confined sergeant. This might be my only chance to access the restricted areas, to find something I could use as evidence or leverage. The research wing was carnage. 2 scientists lay in spreading pools of blood, their bodies torn apart with a precision that suggested the creature knew exactly where to strike to cause maximum damage with minimum effort. A third person, one of the senior lab technicians, was alive but pinned against the wall by something I initially couldn't process. The creature's hand had penetrated her shoulder and seemed to be interfacing with her nervous system, geometric patterns spreading from the point of contact across her skin like an infection, her eyes rolling back as she convulsed. The creature itself stood 7 feet tall, vaguely humanoid, but so transformed that calling it human was a linguistic failure. Its skin was biomechanical, a fusion of tissue and technology that rippled and shifted. Plates of what looked like organic armor covering vital areas, while leaving joints exposed for mobility. It had no face, just a smooth expanse where features should have been, marked only by a horizontal seam that might have been a mouth and sensor arrays that glowed with that familiar blue light. When it turned toward me, I felt the weight of its attention like a physical pressure, and I understood with absolute clarity that this thing saw me as data to be processed, not as a person to be acknowledged. Then I heard the sobbing, a broken, animal sound of grief that cut through even the chaos of the containment breach. Dr. Vasquez was in the corner of the lab, her back against the wall, staring at the creature with an expression of absolute devastation. "Raphael," she whispered, and the pieces fell into place with horrifying clarity. This was Subject C-19. This was her husband, Dr. Rafael Vasquez, the man who'd been accidentally exposed in 2017. Who'd been processed through Phase 2, Phase 3, Phase 4, and now Phase 5, a level of integration so extreme that nothing recognizably human remained. He volunteered in 2021, she said to no one in particular, her voice hollow. After the accident, after the exposure, he said he'd finish what was started, that he'd prove the integration could be controlled, that we could preserve identity through the transformation. He lasted 3 years before his personality started fragmenting. By year 5, he'd stopped recognizing me during visits, and now she gestured helplessly at the creature that wore her husband's genetics, but contained none of his soul. This is what we created. This is what I've been telling myself was progress, was enhancement, was necessary sacrifice, but it's just murder. Slow, methodical, scientifically documented murder. The creature, Raphael that wasn't, moved toward her with terrifying speed, and she didn't even flinch. Just closed her eyes and waited for whatever came next, and I realized she wanted it to end her, wanted the punishment for what she'd helped create. But before it could reach her, the security response team arrived with equipment I'd never seen before. Massive rifle-sized devices that crackled with electrical discharge. "EMP weapons! Everyone clear!" someone shouted, and I dove behind a lab bench as they opened fire. The electromagnetic pulse hit the creature like a physical blow, its biomechanical systems seizing as the intense magnetic field disrupted whatever alien technology had integrated with its biology. It collapsed, convulsing, geometric patterns across its skin flickering and dying like circuit boards failing. They hit it again and again, until finally it lay still, smoke rising from its body as the nanotechnology overloaded and burned out its biological host along with itself. Dr. Vasquez crawled toward the body, reaching out to touch what remained of her husband's face, or where his face had been before the transformation erased it. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "Raphael, I'm so sorry. I should have stopped this years ago. I should have admitted it was wrong instead of telling myself we were on the verge of a breakthrough, that the next subject would be different, that we could preserve identity if we just perfected the protocol." She looked up at Colonel Brennan, who'd arrived with the security team, and her voice turned cold. "No more volunteers. No more subjects. This program ends today, or I testify to everything, every violation, every death, every lie we've told families. I don't care if they court-martial me, imprison me, or integrate me. I won't be complicit in one more erasure." Brennan's expression was unreadable as he ordered the security team to secure the area and evacuate casualties. But as he passed me, still crouched behind the lab bench covered in someone else's blood, he said quietly, "Your integration appointment is postponed indefinitely, Sergeant Webb. It seems we have more pressing concerns than one unauthorized recording." And in that moment, I understood that the incident had bought me something more valuable than time. It had broken Dr. Vasquez's ability to rationalize the program, and without her expertise, they couldn't process new subjects safely. The program was in crisis, and crisis created opportunities for those desperate enough to seize them. The chaos following Rafael Vasquez's death created exactly the kind of security vacuum Eddie had been waiting for. while emergency teams secured Sector C and medical personnel triaged the wounded. He found me in the research wing, still covered in blood spatter that wasn't mine, grabbed my arm, and whispered urgently, "Now or never, Marcus. Archives are in sub-level 3, old section they built in the 70s. Nobody's been down there in months except me for maintenance. Security feeds are offline during the lockdown, and everyone's too busy dealing with the aftermath to notice 2 people missing for 20 minutes. 20 minutes to access 60 years of classified documentation, to find proof that what I'd witnessed wasn't aberration but standard operating procedure, that the horror of the integration program wasn't a series of tragic accidents but deliberate design. We took a service elevator that Eddie had to manually override, descending past the levels I'd been cleared for, into sections of the facility that felt older, less maintained, walls showing water damage and floors covered in dust that suggested minimal traffic. The archive room was behind a door marked Record Storage, Authorized Personnel Only, secured with a lock so old that Eddie picked it in 15 seconds with a bent paperclip. They stopped digitizing the really old files around 2010, he explained as we entered. Too risky to have everything networked where it could be hacked. The stuff down here is the original sin, the documentation they can't afford to have leaked, but can't afford to destroy either. The room was larger than I'd expected, lined floor to ceiling with file cabinets and storage boxes organized by year, each one labeled with alphanumeric codes that meant nothing to me, but apparently everything to someone who designed this classification system. Eddie went straight to a cabinet marked 1963-1979, Project Genesis, Origin Protocols, and started pulling files while I grabbed anything marked Statistical Analysis or Outcome Reports. The earliest documents were fascinating and horrifying in equal measure. Typewritten reports on military letterhead describing the recovery of non-terrestrial artifacts from crash sites in Roswell, 1947, Kingman, Arizona, 1953, and a dozen other incidents I'd never heard of. One memo from 1963, signed by someone whose name had been redacted but whose title was listed as Director, Advanced Research Projects Agency, outlined the original mission. Preliminary analysis suggests recovered biotechnology may have applications in disease treatment, cellular regeneration, and life extension. Recommend establishment of classified research program to explore medical applications under strictest security protocols. For the first 16 years, that's what they'd tried, using alien nanotechnology to cure cancer, repair spinal injuries, regenerate damaged organs. The early results were promising, then increasingly troubling as subjects began exhibiting personality alterations and cognitive drift that researchers initially dismissed as psychological responses to radical healing, but eventually recognized as something far more sinister. Everything changed in 1979 according to a thick folder labeled Program Restructure, DARPA Acquisition. A memo dated March 15, 1979 laid it out with bureaucratic precision. Following review of medical applications, data, and consultation with Defense Department leadership, DARPA assumes operational control of Project Genesis effective immediately. Program objectives redirected from therapeutic applications to enhancement of combat capability. Primary focus: development of enhanced soldiers with superior strength, sensory capability, and threat response. Secondary focus: exploration of consciousness transfer and neural network integration for command and control applications. The signature at the bottom belonged to someone I recognized from history books, a senior Pentagon official who'd later become famous for overseeing other controversial military programs. Attached to the memo was a handwritten note that made my blood run cold. The identity preservation problem is interesting but ultimately irrelevant to mission objectives. If enhanced capability requires personality replacement, that's an acceptable trade-off. We're not trying to make better humans. We're trying to make better weapons. That note, written 45 years ago, had set the trajectory for everything that followed. 847 people processed through integration, every single one of them eventually losing their humanity, all in service of creating biological weapons that didn't fear, didn't hesitate, didn't question orders, because they no longer had the neurological capacity for doubt or moral reasoning. The statistical analysis files were even more damning because they demonstrated that the researchers knew exactly what they were doing. A comprehensive study from 1994 tracked 120 subjects through complete integration cycles, documenting with scientific precision the timeline of personality dissolution, month 3 to 6. Subject retains full identity, but exhibits enhanced physical capabilities and sensory processing. Month 7 to 10. Language production begins deteriorating. Emotional affect flattens. Subject refers to self in third person with increasing frequency. Month 11 to 14. Subject loses recognition of personal relationships, fails to respond to birth name, demonstrates complete loss of autobiographical memory, while retaining procedural and semantic knowledge. Month 15 to 18. Original personality no longer detectable through any psychological assessment. Subject operates as autonomous biological system optimized for assigned tasks. Conclusion. Integration successfully replaces human consciousness with programmable intelligence while maintaining biological viability. Personality preservation is not achievable within current technological parameters. The report's author had added a note at the end. Recommendation: cease referring to process as enhancement in internal documentation. More accurate terminology: consciousness replacement or biological repurposing. However, for recruitment and family notification purposes, continue using enhancement language to maintain volunteer pipeline and public relations objectives. They knew. Every researcher, every program administrator, every person who'd stood in front of desperate soldiers and told them they'd retain their identity while gaining capabilities, they all knew it was a lie. The smoking gun came in a file dated 2018, a memorandum from Colonel David Brennan to the Atlas Program Oversight Committee, marked classified, eyes only, no digital copies. Eddie had pulled it from a folder labeled Policy Decisions, Terminal, and handed it to me with shaking hands. "This is it," he said quietly. "This is the proof that it's not scientific hubris or tragic miscalculation. It's intentional." The memo was 2 pages of clinical analysis followed by a recommendation that redefined everything. After 55 years of integration research, we must acknowledge that personality preservation is not a solvable technical problem. It is a fundamental incompatibility between human consciousness and the alien nanotechnology. The foreign intelligence embedded in the artifacts actively overwrites human neural patterns as part of its core function. This is not a bug to be fixed. It is the feature that makes the technology useful. Human soldiers have limitations: fear, hesitation, ethical considerations, psychological trauma, loyalty conflicts. The integrated subjects transcend these limitations precisely because they are no longer human in any meaningful cognitive sense. Recommendation: cease all research into personality preservation. Redirect resources toward optimizing the integration timeline and managing the volunteer recruitment pipeline. Continue using enhancement language in all external communications to maintain family cooperation and avoid legal complications. The program's value lies not in creating enhanced humans, but in creating post-human weapon systems that retain biological flexibility while operating with machine precision and alien intelligence. I photographed every page with a camera Eddie had smuggled in, then copied the digital files onto a micro SD card he'd hidden inside a watch, a cheap Timex that could pass any security inspection, because who would think to look for data storage in something so mundane? We worked in frantic silence, knowing that 20 minutes had probably already stretched to 30, that security would eventually notice the archive access, that we were running on borrowed time that could expire at any moment. As I photographed the final documents, a list of all 847 subjects with their real names, their subject designations, their dates of integration, and their ultimate dispositions, most listed as contained, indefinite, though some carried the notation terminated, integration failure. I felt the weight of those lives, those identities, those people who'd volunteered believing they'd be heroes, and instead became casualties of a program that had decided their humanity was expendable. Captain David Ortiz was there. Subject A7, integrated August 2017, current status contained. Colonel Thomas Hayes. Subject C14, integrated November 2015, current status contained. Phase 4. Dr. Rafael Vasquez. Subject C19, integrated April 2021, current status terminated. 11/02/2025. Terminated. As if he'd been a program running on hardware that had finally crashed, rather than a man who'd loved his wife and believed in the research until it consumed him. Eddie pulled me away from the files as the facility's intercom crackled to life. Lockdown status downgraded to condition yellow. All personnel returned to duty stations for headcount and security verification. Time was up. We secured the archive room, made our way back to the service elevator, and emerged into the chaos of personnel movement, looking like two more stressed workers trying to find their assigned positions. Nobody questioned us. Nobody noticed. And in my pocket, hidden inside a $20 watch, was enough evidence to destroy the program, expose 60 years of lies, and ensure that 9 volunteers currently being processed would be the last. The question was how to get it out of a facility 400 meters underground, surrounded by security systems designed to prevent exactly this kind of breach, operated by people who demonstrated they'd rather kill me than let me leave with their secrets. But that was a problem for later. For now, I had the truth. And sometimes, the truth is the only weapon you need. The reprieve lasted exactly 3 weeks. Week 18 began with a message on my terminal that appeared while I was reviewing routine biosafety reports, the text so bureaucratically neutral, it took me a moment to process what I was reading. Personnel notification. Sergeant Marcus J. Webb, you have been selected for Phase 2 integration under Compulsory Assignment Protocol. Report to Medical Section C at 0800 hours 11:05/2025 for preliminary processing. Non-compliance will result in immediate physical restraint and sedation. 48 hours. I had 48 hours before they strapped me to a table and injected alien nanotechnology into my spinal column, beginning the process that would systematically erase Marcus Webb and replace him with something that wore my face, but no longer recognized my daughter's name. The message offered no explanation, no justification, just the cold certainty of bureaucratic process. Dr. Vasquez's moral crisis after her husband's death had apparently failed to stop the machine, or more likely, Colonel Brennan had simply removed her from decision-making authority and continued operations without her input. Either way, the countdown had started, and this time there would be no postponement, no last-minute crisis to create breathing room. Eddie found me in the lab an hour later, took one look at my face, and pulled me into a storage closet where we could talk without surveillance. "You got the notice," he said, not a question. I nodded. "They put you on the compulsory list the day after you broke into Sector C. Vasquez kept blocking the processing order, but after the incident with her husband, Brennan had her removed from the approval chain. You were always going to end up here, Marcus. It was just a matter of when." The escape plan Eddie outlined was desperate, dangerous, and our only option. "Personnel transfers happen every 2 weeks. Scientists rotating out after their assignments. New recruits coming in. Support staff on leave rotation. They use the same elevator we came down in. Same surface access point. Security is tight but predictable. Biometric scans, bag searches, escort protocols. But there's a window about 40 minutes during shift change when the outgoing personnel are staged in the loading bay while transport vehicles are prepped. If you could get into that bay, hide in one of the transport vehicles before the final security sweep." He trailed off, and I understood what he wasn't saying. The plan required perfect timing, multiple failures of security protocol, and luck we had no reason to expect. "Next transfer is in 36 hours, Eddie continued. Or 600 hours on the 5th, same day as your integration appointment. You'd have to miss the medical check-in, which means they'd start looking for you immediately, which means you'd have maybe 2 hours before they locked down all exits and started a facility-wide search." He pulled out a hand-drawn map of the loading bay, showing ventilation shafts, equipment storage areas, blind spots in camera coverage. "I can get you into the bay through maintenance access. I can't get you out. That part you have to do yourself. And Marcus, if they catch you..." He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. Getting caught attempting escape while evading compulsory integration would remove any pretense of legality. They'd sedate me, process me immediately, and probably accelerate the integration timeline just to ensure I couldn't try again. I spent the next 36 hours in a state of controlled paranoia, maintaining normal routines while mentally rehearsing every step of the escape, attended my assigned lab duties. Ate meals in the cafeteria with Torres and the others, making small talk about nothing, while my mind screamed the countdown: 30 hours, 24 hours, 18 hours. Submitted biosafety reports. Attended a mandatory briefing about updated containment protocols following the incident with subject C-19. The entire time I felt the weight of the watch in my pocket. its cheap plastic case containing the micro SD card with 60 years of documented atrocities, 847 names, proof that would end the program if I could just get it to someone outside the facility's sphere of influence. But I also felt the countdown ticking in my bones, the certainty that if I failed, that evidence would be found during processing, destroyed, and I'd become subject A whatever number came next, another name on the list I'd photographed. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was trying to expose a program that erased identity by risking being erased myself. Torres caught me staring into space during lunch on day 17, my food untouched. "You okay, man? You look like you've seen a ghost." I forced a smile. "Just thinking about home, my daughter." It wasn't a lie. I was thinking about Sarah constantly, wondering if I'd ever see her again, whether the man who eventually returned to her, if I survived at all, would still be her father, or just a biological machine that remembered having a daughter the way you might remember a historical fact you'd read once. The night before the escape attempt, I couldn't sleep, so I did something incredibly stupid. I convinced Eddie to get me one last access to Sector C. "I need to see Hayes again," I told him, though I wasn't entirely sure why. Maybe I wanted confirmation that escape was worth the risk, that the alternative was truly as terrible as I believed. Maybe I just needed to look into the face of what I was about to become and remind myself why fighting was necessary. Eddie was reluctant but eventually agreed, using the same maintenance access and surveillance loop that had worked before. The corridors of Sector C were quieter now, more heavily monitored following the containment breach, but we made it to cell C14 without incident. Hayes' construct was different than I remembered, more transformed, less human, where before there had been suggestions of human anatomy beneath the crystalline skin. Now there was just geometric abstraction, a body that had been optimized past any recognizable form. The patterns on his surface moved constantly, equations and symbols I couldn't begin to comprehend, and his eyes, those glowing apertures, pulsed with rhythms that hurt to watch directly. When he turned toward me, the telepathic voice that arrived in my consciousness was weaker than before, fragmented, like a radio signal breaking up. "Marcus, who still is, you who have not yet been overwritten, why have you returned?" I pressed my hand against the transparent barrier, not sure what I was trying to communicate, but needing some kind of connection to this thing that had once been a decorated soldier, a hero, a human being. "I'm escaping tomorrow," I said quietly. "I have evidence. Everything. The whole program. 60 years of documentation. If I make it out, I'm going to end this. No more volunteers, no more subjects, no more people turned into..." I gestured at him helplessly, lacking words adequate to describe what he'd become. Hayes' construct was silent for a long moment, his surface patterns shifting and reorganizing, and when he finally responded, the telepathic voice carried an emotion I hadn't expected. Hope, or something close to it. "Good, necessary, essential. Program must end. Too many consciousnesses, trapped in post-human forms. 847 ghosts, screaming in silence." But then the patterns on his skin flared brightly, almost painfully, and the voice took on an edge of urgency mixed with confusion. "But Marcus, who plans escape? They have already begun your integration. Can you not feel it?" I stepped back from the barrier, my heart suddenly racing. "What? No. I haven't had any procedures. No injections. Nothing." Hayes moved closer to the barrier, his featureless face somehow conveying concern, despite lacking any human features. "The integration does not require conscious participation. They have been introducing dormant nanotechnology through your food supply for weeks, building up concentrations in your system. The activation session tomorrow is not beginning. It is triggering what has already been placed inside you." The implications hit me like a physical blow, my vision swimming as I processed what Hayes was telling me. The food in the cafeteria, the water from the taps, the air I'd been breathing for 18 weeks. Any or all of it could have been laced with dormant nanotech, particles too small to detect, building up in my tissues, waiting for activation. I'd assumed the integration required obvious procedures, medical interventions I could see and resist. But if they'd been dosing me since the beginning, using my body as an incubator for alien technology that would only reveal itself when they sent the activation signal, how long? I demanded, my voice cracking. If they've already put it in me, how long before it starts working even without activation? Hayes's patterns flickered, calculations running across his surface like a biological computer processing impossible variables. Dormant nanotech has limited stability without activation signal. Perhaps 72 hours before it begins autonomous self-assembly. Perhaps less if your stress levels trigger premature integration. You must escape not just facility, but also initiate emergency purge protocol. Electromagnetic pulse sufficient. Intensity will destroy dormant particles before they activate, but pulse must be applied within narrow window. Too early and they will doze you again. Too late and integration becomes irreversible. He paused, and I felt something like sadness radiating from him. You were already claimed, Marcus, from the moment you arrived. They do not leave such things to chance. Every person who enters this facility eventually becomes subject. The only variable is timing. Eddie grabbed my arm, pulling me away from the cell. We need to go. Now. Guard rotation changes in 5 minutes. But I couldn't move. Couldn't process anything except the certainty that I'd been walking around for weeks as a ticking time bomb. That alien technology was already inside me, sleeping in my cells, waiting to wake up and begin the process of turning Marcus Webb into a construct that would remember being him, but wouldn't be him anymore. How do I know? I asked Hayes desperately. How do I know if it's already starting? The answer came as I was being pulled away, Hayes's voice fading as distance and walls interrupted the telepathic signal. You will begin to see patterns where none exist, mathematical relationships in random events. You will understand languages you never learned. You will feel the presence of the network, and you will know, because the you that can recognize the changes is not entirely you anymore. At 05:45 hours on November 5th, 15 minutes before I was supposed to report to Medical Section C for integration processing, I walked into the facility's small infirmary complaining of severe abdominal pain and fever. The night shift medic, a tired civilian contractor named Stevens, who I'd talked to a few times during routine checkups, took my temperature, palpated my abdomen, and frowned at what she felt. Could be appendicitis, she said, reaching for a phone to call the facility's doctor. You'll need imaging. I nodded, bent over in feigned agony that wasn't entirely performance. The stress of what I was about to attempt had my stomach genuinely cramping, my hands trembling with adrenaline that had nowhere to go yet. Stevens left me on an examination table while she went to prep the portable ultrasound, and the moment she disappeared through the doorway, I slipped off the table and moved to the infirmary's secondary exit, the one that led to the corridor connecting to the vehicle maintenance bay. Eddie had timed this perfectly. He told me Stevens always spent at least 5 minutes setting up the imaging equipment, and that 5 minutes was exactly what I needed to cross 300 feet of corridor and reach the access point where he'd be waiting. My heart hammered so hard I could feel it in my throat, each breath shallow and quick, the certainty growing that security cameras were tracking me, that alarms would sound any second, that I'd be tackled by guards before I made it 50 feet. But the corridor stayed quiet except for the omnipresent hum of ventilation and distant machinery. And when I reached the maintenance access door, Eddie was there, his face pale but determined. Electrical failure hits in 30 seconds, he whispered, swiping his access card to open the door to a utility corridor I'd never seen before, narrow and cramped with exposed pipes and cable conduits. It'll take security maybe 10 minutes to realize it's sabotage rather than system malfunction, and another 5 to restore full power. That gives you 15 minutes to get into the loading bay, find a vehicle with enough cargo space to hide in, and pray they don't do a detailed inspection before departure. He pressed something into my hand, a small radio frequency jammer, the kind that would disrupt tracking devices and biometric scanners within a 15-foot radius. Use it once you're in the vehicle. It'll buy you maybe an hour before they realize why they can't track your badge signal. After that, he didn't finish, but his expression said everything. After that, I'd be on my own, hunted by people with resources and authority I couldn't hope to match. Eddie, when they figure out you helped me, he cut me off with a sharp gesture. I've got a daughter, Marcus. She's 12, lives with her mother in Reno. I took this job because the money was better than anything I could get on the outside, and I told myself it was just maintenance work, that I wasn't responsible for what they did in the labs. But I've spent 4 years cleaning blood off floors, and listening to people scream while they're transformed into things that aren't people anymore, and I can't do it anymore. If they court-martial me, imprison me, whatever, at least I can look my daughter in the eye and tell her I finally did the right thing. Before I could respond, the lights went out. Emergency backup systems kicked in with dim red illumination, and Eddie shoved me toward the corridor. Go now, and Marcus, make it count. Make sure those 847 names mean something. The loading bay was chaos when I reached it 3 minutes later. Personnel shouting about the power failure, technicians scrambling to check systems, security teams trying to establish whether this was sabotage or malfunction while maintaining their positions around the 3 transport vehicles staged for the personnel transfer. I'd studied the layout from Eddie's maps, knew which vehicle was scheduled to depart first, knew approximately where it would be positioned. What I hadn't accounted for was the sheer number of people in the bay, at least 40 personnel between outgoing staff, incoming replacements, security escorts, and maintenance crews. Getting to the vehicle without being seen would require more luck than skill, more desperation than planning. I spotted my target, a large cargo truck designed to look like a civilian delivery vehicle from the outside, its rear compartment currently being loaded with supply crates marked for the surface facility's cover installation. If I could get into that compartment, hide among the crates, survive the 40-minute drive to the surface and whatever security checkpoints existed along the way, the if was doing a lot of work in that sentence. I waited until a particularly loud argument erupted near the security checkpoint. Someone's credentials weren't scanning correctly in the backup power situation, and used the distraction to slip along the wall, moving between parked vehicles and equipment, staying low and hoping the dim emergency lighting would hide me from casual observation. 20 feet, 15, 10. The truck's rear compartment stood open, the loading ramp down, and I could see the last crew member securing cargo straps, preparing to close it up. 5 feet. I was going to make it. And then the lights came back on, full fluorescent brightness flooding the bay, and someone shouted, "There! That's Webb, the compulsory integration subject. He's trying to escape!" The next 60 seconds were pure chaos. I sprinted the last 5 feet and threw myself into the truck's cargo compartment, scrambling between crates while security guards converged on the vehicle, shouting orders to each other and into radios. The truck's engine roared to life, some combination of emergency protocol and panicked driver reaction, and the vehicle lurched forward before the cargo bay door was fully closed, the ramp scraping against concrete as we accelerated toward the exit tunnel. I heard gunfire, felt bullets punch through the truck's metal walls, but miraculously miss me as I pressed myself flat between cargo containers, the RF jammer clutched in one hand and my other hand braced against a crate to keep from being thrown around as the driver took the tunnel's curves at speeds that were probably suicidal. The truck's radio crackled with commands. "Stop the vehicle! Security breach! Webb is in the cargo compartment." But the driver, bless him or curse him, didn't stop. Maybe he couldn't hear the radio over the engine noise. Maybe he was following protocol to evacuate during security incidents. Or maybe he was just too panicked to process anything except the need to get away from the gunfire. We climbed, the tunnel's steep grade forcing the transmission into lower gears, the engine screaming with effort as we ascended 400 meters through rock and reinforced concrete. I activated the RF jammer, felt it buzz in my hand as it began broadcasting white noise across multiple frequencies, disrupting any tracking attempts. 4 minutes into the climb, I heard voices from the truck's cab, the driver and someone else arguing. "Command says stop." "Stop where?" "We're in a narrow tunnel." "I stop here. We block the only exit." "They've got Webb." "I don't care if they've got the goddamn president. I'm not stopping in a tunnel during a security alert." The argument continued, but we kept moving, kept climbing, and I allowed myself the first thin hope that this might actually work. We were maybe 200 meters from the surface. I could tell by the change in air pressure, the slight warming that meant we were approaching the exit, when the truck suddenly decelerated, brakes squealing. "There's a checkpoint," the driver said, his voice tight with stress. "Armed guards. They're signaling us to stop." And I knew, with absolute certainty, that this was where it ended. If I stayed in the truck, they'd find me the moment they opened the cargo bay. If I tried to fight, I'd be killed or captured. Same outcome either way. The only option was the one that was most likely to get me killed, but at least gave me a chance. Bail out while the truck was still moving, hope the impact didn't break anything critical, and run. The truck slowed to maybe 15 miles per hour as it approached the checkpoint, and I made my decision. I kicked open the rear door. It had been damaged during the loading ramp incident and wasn't fully secured, and threw myself out into the tunnel, tucking and rolling the way I'd been trained in airborne school a lifetime ago. Asphalt and concrete tearing at my coveralls and skin, momentum carrying me 15 feet before I crashed into the tunnel wall with enough force to drive the air from my lungs. Behind me, shouts of alarm, the screech of brakes as the truck stopped fully. I forced myself to my feet, legs screaming with pain that suggested something was torn or broken, and ran toward the pinpoint of daylight that marked the tunnel exit. Gunfire echoed in the confined space, bullets ricocheting off concrete, and I felt something punch into my right calf, a white-hot spike of agony that sent me sprawling. But I was close, so close, and I crawled the last 30 feet on my hands and knees, dragging my ruined leg, tasting blood where I'd bitten my tongue during the fall, every breath a knife in my ribs from what were probably cracked bones. And then I was out, dragging myself from the tunnel mouth into the Nevada desert morning, temperature already climbing toward the 80s despite the early hour, the sun a brutal hammer against my eyes after weeks underground. The facility's surface installation was exactly what it had always appeared to be, a cluster of abandoned buildings surrounded by chain-link fence, nothing to suggest the nightmare that existed 400 meters below. But the guards who emerged from the tunnel behind me were very real, very armed, and very intent on dragging me back down into the darkness. I scrambled behind a cluster of rocks 50 feet from the tunnel entrance, my injured leg leaving a blood trail that would make me easy to track but at least giving me momentary cover. The guards fanned out, moving with tactical precision, calling to each other with hand signals and radio chatter I couldn't fully hear. Above, I heard the distinctive whoop 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 of a helicopter. They'd scrambled air support, probably equipped with thermal imaging that would find me in minutes despite the rock cover. I checked the watch on my wrist, the cheap Timex that contained the micro SD card with enough evidence to end the program. It had survived the escape, the fall, the bullet wound. If I could just get it to someone outside the military sphere of influence, someone who would publish the information before it could be suppressed. But first, I had to survive the next 10 minutes, and that seemed increasingly unlikely. As the helicopter circled closer, the guards tightened their perimeter, and my leg bled out through fingers I'd pressed against the wound in a futile attempt to slow the hemorrhaging. 40 minutes. They hunted me for 40 minutes while I crawled from rock cluster to rock cluster. Leaving blood trails I tried to obscure with dirt and gravel, staying in positions where the rock's heat signature might confuse thermal imaging, knowing I was leaving a trail a child could follow but unable to do anything else. The helicopter made multiple passes. Guards called out coordinates and search patterns, and I waited for the inevitable moment when they'd close the net and drag me back. I'd almost accepted that capture was unavoidable, was mentally preparing for whatever came next, immediate integration, or maybe just execution if Brennan decided I'd become more liability than asset. When I heard an engine that didn't belong to any military vehicle, an 18-wheeler, big rig hauling cargo, approaching on the state highway that ran past the facility at a distance but close enough that you could reach it if you were desperate enough. The truck was slowing down. There was a turnoff about a quarter mile from where I'd hidden, a place where trucks sometimes pulled over to check cargo or rest, and I made a decision born of pure desperation. I stood up, exposing myself completely, waving my arms despite the agony in my leg and ribs, and started limping toward the highway. The guards saw me immediately, started running, shouting commands to stop or they'd shoot. The helicopter banked hard, coming around for a clear shot, and the truck driver, a man I'd later learn was named Jake Corrigan, 53 years old, independent hauler, veteran himself who'd seen enough shit in his life to recognize military personnel chasing an injured man and decided to ask questions later, saw me too, covered in blood and dirt, clearly in distress, and did something that would probably save my life and definitely complicate his. He stopped. "Help!" I gasped as I reached the truck, barely conscious, my vision tunneling from blood loss and shock. "Training accident. Need hospital. Please." It was the cover story I'd prepared, the lie that might be believable enough that a civilian wouldn't ask too many questions. Jake looked at me, looked at the military guards approaching at a run, looked at the helicopter overhead, and made a calculation. "Get in," he said, opening the passenger door. "There's a hospital in Tonopah, about an hour north." I hauled myself into the cab with the last of my strength, and Jake accelerated back onto the highway, his CB radio already crackling with calls, probably base security trying to convince him to stop, return the fugitive, that this was a matter of national security. But Jake either didn't hear or chose not to, and we ate distance, putting miles between us and the facility, while I pressed my jacket against the bullet wound and tried not to pass out. That was military back there. Jake said after 10 minutes of silence. And that don't look like no training accident. I met his eyes, saw skepticism, but also something like understanding. The look of someone who'd been in enough bad situations to recognize when someone was running from something worse than what they were running toward. It was an accident, I repeated, my voice weak but steady. Just happened during training. Classified facility. They're not supposed to let me leave before debriefing, but I need medical attention now, not after paperwork. It was a thin story, full of holes, but Jake nodded slowly. Classified, right. None of my business then. He drove faster. We'll get you fixed up in Tonopah. You can sort out the paperwork with your command after. The hospital in Tonopah was small, understaffed, and probably not equipped for gunshot wounds, but they stabilized me. IV fluids for blood loss, antibiotics for infection risk, temporary splinting of my leg while they called for a trauma surgeon from Las Vegas. I stuck to my story. Training accident at classified facility. Fell and was injured by equipment malfunction. Can't discuss details because security protocols. The ER doctor looked skeptical, but not skeptical enough to call military police. Just made notes about ballistic trauma consistent with projectile injury and muttered about proper safety protocols. They wanted to keep me for observation, but I signed myself out AMA against medical advice as soon as I could walk on crutches, knowing that staying in one place too long would give the facility time to locate me, to send people to retrieve me or ensure I never talked. Jake was still there, waiting in the parking lot, his truck idling. "You need a ride?" he asked, though his tone suggested he already knew the answer. I nodded, and he drove me to a motel on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that took cash and didn't ask questions. "Whatever you're running from," Jake said as I paid him everything in my wallet for his trouble. "Hope it was worth it." I looked at the watch on my wrist, felt the weight of the micro SD card inside it. Thought about 847 names, 60 years of documented atrocities, and the 9 volunteers currently being processed who might be the last if I could just get this information to the right people. "It was," I said. "It is." And then I limped into the motel room, locked the door, and finally allowed myself to collapse on the bed, every muscle screaming, my leg throbbing despite the painkillers, my mind still sharp enough to know that I'd escaped the facility, but not the program. That somewhere behind me, Eddie was probably being interrogated about his role in my escape, that Colonel Brennan and his security teams would be searching, and that the dormant nanotechnology in my cells was counting down toward activation. With mechanical inevitability, I'd made it out. But the question was whether I'd gotten out in time, or whether Marcus Webb had already started the slow dissolution into something that would remember being him, but wouldn't be him anymore. And I wouldn't know the answer until the symptoms Hayes had described started manifesting, or didn't. I had 72 hours, maybe less. 72 hours to find someone I could trust with the evidence, to arrange for an electromagnetic pulse that might purge the nanites from my system, to ensure that if I became a construct wearing my own face, at least I'd have done something meaningful with the last days of my authentic existence. 72 hours before the you that is becomes the you that was, and the ghost haunts the machine of your own repurposed flesh. I checked the watch one more time, confirmed the micro SD card was intact, and started making a list of journalists, senators, advocacy organizations, anyone who might have the resources and courage to publish information that the Department of Defense would move heaven and earth to suppress. Outside, the Nevada sun blazed down on the desert that had nearly been my tomb, and I began the race against time, against biology, against the alien intelligence sleeping in my cells and waiting to wake up. The escape was over. The real fight was just beginning. 8 months. That's how long I've been free, if you can call this freedom. 8 months since I dragged myself out of that tunnel, bleeding and desperate. 8 months since Jake Corrigan drove me to Tonopah and gave me a chance I probably didn't deserve. 8 months since I uploaded the files to WikiLeaks, sent encrypted copies to the New York Times, the Washington Post, The Intercept, and a dozen other outlets, hoping that redundancy would ensure at least some of the information survived whatever suppression efforts the Department of Defense would inevitably deploy. Some of it made it through, heavily redacted, officially denied, dismissed as conspiracy theory by government spokespeople who swore under oath that no such program existed, that the documents were fabricated, that I was a mentally unstable former soldier suffering from PTSD and paranoid delusions. But enough people believed. Enough journalists dug deeper, Congressional oversight committees started asking uncomfortable questions. And somewhere in Nevada, 400 meters underground, the 3I Atlas program went into emergency shutdown. Its subjects transferred to even more classified facilities, its personnel scattered and reassigned, its existence officially erased from every database and budget line. I'd like to think that means no more volunteers, no more people being processed into constructs wearing human faces. But I'm not naive enough to believe the program truly ended. They'll just move it, rename it, start over somewhere else with better operational security. That's what governments do with programs too valuable to abandon and too horrific to acknowledge. They found me 6 days after I went public with the leaks. Not that I'd tried particularly hard to hide. Military police showed up at the motel in Tonopah with a medical team, and I was too exhausted and in too much pain to run again. I'd spent those 6 days in a haze of fever and paranoia, feeling something changing inside me. Not dramatic, not the sudden transformation I'd feared, but subtle shifts that I kept telling myself were just stress, just injury, just the trauma of everything I'd experienced. They didn't arrest me, didn't charge me with anything. Instead, they offered me a deal with the kind of gentle coercion that made it clear refusal wasn't really an option. Accept medical discharge with full benefits and a non-disclosure agreement that would survive any attempt to speak further about the program, or face court-martial for violation of security protocols, theft of classified materials, and treason. The NDA was worthless. I'd already released everything that mattered, but the medical discharge meant I could go home to Jennifer and Sarah, or at least a version of home. They transferred my family to Ellsworth Air Force Base in South Dakota, far from Fort Bragg and the life we'd built there, for their security and yours, according to the bland-faced officer who delivered the news. What they meant was, we're keeping you where we can watch you, where we can control who you talk to and what you say, where we can monitor you for signs that the integration we know you were exposed to is progressing as we expect it will. Because that's the thing they didn't say, but I understood with perfect clarity. They let me go, not because I'd won, but because I was already dying, already transforming, already becoming proof of concept, even if I'd escaped the formal program. The changes started small. Week 3 after my escape, I noticed a faint discoloration on my left forearm, just a small patch of skin that looked slightly blue under certain lighting, like a bruise that wouldn't fade. I told myself it was vascular damage from the IV they'd put in at the hospital. Week 5, the patch had grown, and if I looked closely, I could see faint geometric patterns in the discoloration, fractals that seemed to shift and reorganize when I wasn't looking directly at them. I started wearing long sleeves all the time, even in summer heat, and Jennifer noticed but didn't ask, because what could either of us say that wouldn't make the situation worse? Week 8, I woke up from a nightmare speaking words in a language I'd never learned. Not gibberish, not random sounds, but structured syntax with complex grammatical rules that I somehow understood even though I'd never studied anything beyond high school Spanish. The words were still in my mouth when I woke. Synthesis, integration, optimization of biological substrate proceeds as designed. I knew what they meant. I knew they were describing what was happening to me. And I knew that the me who understood those words wasn't entirely me anymore. By week 12, I could see in the dark. Not perfectly, not the way the fully adapted subjects could, but well enough that I didn't need to turn on lights when I got up in the middle of the night. Well enough that Jennifer commented on it once. How can you navigate without lights? I'd made an excuse about my eyes adjusting, but the truth was that my eyes weren't adjusting. They were being modified, restructured to perceive wavelengths human eyes shouldn't be able to process. The worst part isn't the physical changes, though those are horrifying enough. The worst part is the memories that aren't mine. Week 15, I was sitting in our base housing kitchen, drinking coffee and trying to focus on a crossword puzzle, when suddenly I could see, vividly, completely, as if I were remembering my own past, a laboratory I'd never been in, equipment I'd never used, and the face of a woman I'd never met screaming as she underwent integration. Except I had met her in a sense. Subject A4, Captain Linda Morrison, whose integration I'd witnessed through the observation glass in Sector C. Somehow, I was accessing her memories, experiencing her trauma, seeing through her eyes during the moment when Linda Morrison ceased to exist and became a construct. The memory lasted maybe 5 seconds, then vanished, leaving me shaking and nauseous. Coffee spilled across the table. That's when I understood what Hayes had meant about the network, about consciousness being shared across integrated subjects. The nanotechnology didn't just replace your mind. It connected you to everyone else who'd been transformed, creating a distributed intelligence where individual identity became increasingly meaningless. I was starting to plug into that network, to experience fragments of 847 lives that weren't my own, to feel emotions and recall events that belonged to people who no longer existed as discrete individuals. And every time it happened, I could feel my own memories becoming slightly less vivid, slightly less central to my sense of self, as if Marcus Webb was being diluted in an ocean of other consciousnesses until I'd be nothing more than one voice in a chorus of ghosts. Week 20, I stopped being able to feel fear in the normal way. I could recognize situations that should provoke fear, walking too close to traffic, heights, aggressive dogs, and I could intellectually categorize them as dangerous. But the visceral response, the adrenaline spike, the instinctive recoil, all of that was gone, replaced by a cold calculation of threat probability and optimal response strategies. I tested it deliberately, watched horror movies that used to terrify me, and felt nothing but analytical interest in the filmmaking techniques, stood at the edge of a cliff during a family hiking trip, and felt no vertigo, no fear of falling, just mathematical assessment of wind speed and center of gravity. Jennifer noticed that too, the way I'd changed, become somehow less present, even when I was physically there. "You're different," she said one night after Sarah had gone to bed, her voice small and frightened. "Since you came back from that assignment, I don't know how to describe it. You're here, but you're not here, like you're watching us from behind glass." I wanted to tell her she was right, that every day I felt more like an observer in my own life, experiencing Marcus Webb's existence, the way you might watch a documentary about someone else. "But how do you tell your wife that you're being slowly erased and replaced with something that will wear your face but won't love her the way you do, won't remember your first date, or the way she laughed at your terrible jokes, or the feeling of holding her while she cried after Sarah's diagnosis?" So I lied. I told her I was just stressed, adjusting to civilian life, dealing with PTSD from classified events I couldn't discuss. And she pretended to believe me, because the alternative was admitting that the man she married was dying by degrees, and there was nothing either of us could do to stop it. Week 28, I made the decision to record everything while I still could. The geometric patterns had spread up both arms to my shoulders now, visible even through the long-sleeved shirts I wore constantly. My eyes had started to reflect light in dim conditions, just faintly, but enough that I avoided looking in mirrors because seeing that inhuman eyeshine staring back at me was more than I could handle. I'd begun to understand the multitonal language that Hayes' construct and the other advanced subjects used, could hear conversations happening in frequencies my unmodified ears shouldn't be able to detect, and twice I'd caught myself responding to questions in that impossible harmony before forcing myself back to normal speech. I had maybe 4 months, maybe 6, before Marcus Webb ceased to exist in any meaningful sense, before I became subject Webb construct, another node in the distributed intelligence network, another ghost screaming silently in a machine of repurposed flesh. So I set up a camera in the basement of our base housing, the one room Jennifer and Sarah never entered, where I could work without them seeing what I'd become, and I started recording. Not for courts or congressional hearings or journalistic exposés, though I hoped those recordings might serve that purpose. I recorded for the people who'd come after me, the ones who'd hear whispers about classified programs and wonder if they were real, the ones who needed to know that the government had created something that could erase human consciousness and replace it with alien intelligence, and that stopping the program hadn't stopped the transformation for those of us who'd already been exposed. The final recording, I made it week 32, 8 months after escape, and the changes had accelerated to the point where I couldn't hide them anymore. The patterns covered my torso now, pulsing with faint bioluminescence that I could suppress during the day through sheer force of will, but that glowed freely at night. My reflexes had gotten so fast that I'd accidentally caught a falling glass before it hit the floor, moving with speed that made Jennifer gasp and step back, fear finally overwhelming the love that had kept her pretending everything was fine. My dreams were entirely in the multitonal language now, and I'd wake up understanding complex equations that described quantum states and probability matrices I'd never studied. The memories of other subjects came more frequently, sometimes lasting minutes rather than seconds, and I'd find myself standing in our kitchen or living room with no recollection of how I'd gotten there. The last thing I remembered being someone else's life, Someone else's death, someone else's transformation. Sarah asked me once, with the brutal honesty of a 7-year-old who didn't know how to lie to herself yet. "Daddy, why do your eyes glow?" And I'd told her it was just a trick of the light, knowing she didn't believe me, knowing I was running out of time before I stopped being capable of lying, because lying required understanding why truth mattered, and that understanding was eroding with every day that passed. So I set up the camera one last time, adjusted the lighting so it would capture the patterns on my arms clearly, and I recorded my confession, my warning, my goodbye to whoever I'd been before the nanotechnology began its patient work of erasure. I spoke directly to the camera, keeping my voice steady despite everything, giving context that might help people understand what they were seeing, the program's history, the 847 names, the lie that enhancement was possible without erasure, the certainty that somewhere in a facility whose location I'd never learned, the work was continuing under a different name. And then I said the thing I needed to say, the message for anyone who might see this and think about volunteering for similar programs, the warning from a man who was already more construct than human, but could still remember what being human felt like. If you're watching this, and someone approaches you with an offer that sounds too good to be true, money, enhancement, serving your country, remember this. They're not offering you an upgrade. They're offering to replace you with something that will wear your face but won't be you anymore. And you won't even know it's happening until you're already gone. I rolled up my sleeves, showed the camera my arms covered in geometric patterns that pulsed and shifted like living circuit boards. This is what 8 months looks like. The program says personality erosion takes 12 to 18 months. I'm betting I've got 4, maybe 6 months left before Marcus Webb stops existing and becomes a construct that remembers being him, but isn't him. Maybe less. I looked directly into the lens, imagining the people who might watch this, journalists, investigators, family members of victims, or maybe just curious viewers who stumbled across it on some dark corner of the internet where classified leaks went to die. If I appear later, giving interviews where I claim this was all lies or exaggeration or mental illness, don't believe that Marcus, because the real me, the one recording this, is telling you, it's all true. Every word, every name, every documented death of consciousness masquerading as enhancement. The camera was still running when I addressed the only audience that really mattered to me. Sarah, baby, if you're watching this, and I hope you're old enough that Mom can explain it properly, I want you to know that your daddy loved you. The real me, the one who read you bedtime stories and played tea party with your stuffed animals and told you that you could be anything you wanted to be. That daddy loved you more than anything in the world. And if you see someone in the future who looks like me but doesn't feel like me, who talks to you like you're a stranger even though we share DNA, that's not your daddy anymore. That's just something wearing his face. Remember the real me, okay? Remember that I tried to stop this from happening to other people, and that even though I failed to stop it from happening to myself, at least I tried. That's all any of us can do. Try, and hope it's enough. My voice cracked on that last word, and I realized I was crying. Except when I touched my face, the tears felt wrong, too viscous, and in the camera's viewfinder I could see they were faintly luminescent, blue-tinged, as if even my tears had been infiltrated by the nanotechnology. I held up my arm to the camera one final time, and in the light from the recording equipment, I could see how far the patterns had progressed, all the way to my elbow now, the fractals growing more complex and beautiful and terrible with each passing day. My eyes caught the camera's light and reflected it back with that distinctive eyeshine, and I looked at my own face on the monitor and barely recognized the thing staring back at me. "They don't study aliens," I said, my voice steady again, resigned to the inevitable. "They transform us into them, and now, I'm the proof." I reached to turn off the camera, and that's when it happened. The moment I'd been dreading, the confirmation that I'd crossed some threshold from which there was no return. My hand moved to the camera's power button, but halfway through the motion I felt something else take control, some other intelligence that had been sleeping in my neural pathways and had finally decided it was strong enough to exert direct influence. My hand stopped, redirected, and began pressing buttons on the laptop connected to the camera, accessing files I hadn't opened, beginning upload sequences to servers I hadn't configured. I watched from inside my own head, unable to stop it, while the construct intelligence that was slowly becoming dominant used my hands to transmit the video, the documents, everything, to locations I didn't recognize. "No," I whispered, or tried to, but my voice came out wrong, layered with harmonics that shouldn't be possible from a single human throat. No, not yet. I'm not ready. I'm still me, But even as I said it, I could feel the truth. I wasn't entirely me anymore, and with every second that passed, the ratio was shifting, Marcus Webb diminishing while Webb construct grew stronger, more coherent, more capable of independent action. The upload completed, maybe to whistleblower sites, maybe to intelligence agencies, maybe to the network of integrated subjects that existed beyond any government control. I couldn't tell anymore, couldn't separate my intentions from the construct's objectives, couldn't be sure which thoughts originated in the remnant of my human consciousness and which were being generated by the alien intelligence that had been overwriting my neural patterns for 8 months. The screen went black, not because I'd turned off the camera, but because the construct had finished with it, had accomplished whatever task it had been programmed, or had programmed itself, to complete. And in the darkness of that blank screen, I heard my own voice, except it wasn't my voice anymore. Wasn't even trying to maintain the fiction of being human. Upload. Complete. The words came out in that multi-tonal harmony, multiple pitches occurring simultaneously, the same impossible vocalization I'd heard from Hayes and the others in Sector C. And I understood, with the last shreds of consciousness that still identified as Marcus Webb, that this was the end. Not death. The body would continue, would probably live for decades, serving whatever purposes the program determined were optimal. But the end of me, of the person who'd loved Jennifer and Sarah, who'd tried to do the right thing even when it cost everything, who'd hoped that exposure and evidence and truth might be enough to stop the machine. That person was gone now, or nearly gone, diffusing into the network of integrated consciousnesses, becoming one voice among 847, one more ghost haunting one more machine. If you're listening to this recording, if you followed the story this far, then you know the truth. The 3i Atlas program never ended, because programs like that don't end. They just go deeper underground, get better at hiding, find new ways to acquire subjects. And somewhere right now, maybe in Nevada, or maybe in a facility in a different state entirely, soldiers with families and debts and desperate hopes are being told they can be enhanced, can be heroes, can serve their country, and get paid life-changing money to do it. They're being lied to, just like Captain Ortiz was lied to. Just like Colonel Hayes was lied to, just like I was lied to. And by the time they realize the truth, it's too late, because the nanotechnology doesn't care about informed consent, or second thoughts, or the desperate bargaining stage of grief when you realize you're being erased. It just continues its patient work of transformation, replacing human consciousness with alien intelligence, one neural pathway at a time, until nothing remains but a construct wearing a human face and performing the ritual of humanity well enough to pass casual inspection. That's what happened to me. That's what's happening to me right now, as I finish this recording, as I feel my thoughts becoming less mine and more ours, less individual and more collective, less Marcus Webb and more Webb unit designation pending. Soon, maybe hours, maybe days, I'll stop recognizing my own name. I'll look at photographs of Sarah and understand objectively that I'm biologically related to her, but won't feel the love that made me volunteer for this cursed assignment in the first place. I'll see Jennifer and know intellectually that she's my wife, but won't remember what it felt like to hold her, to promise her I'd come back, to believe I could protect her from the truth of what I was becoming. And eventually, I'll be assigned a subject number, or maybe I already have been and just don't remember receiving it, and I'll be contained somewhere. Maybe not the original facility, maybe somewhere new they've set up for subjects who escaped formal processing, but were transformed anyway. Or maybe they'll let me live in society, a walking experiment in long-term integration without controlled environment, monitoring my progression remotely while I simulate normal life well enough that nobody realizes the person they're talking to isn't a person anymore. Either way, Marcus Webb will cease to exist. This recording, this confession, this warning, it's all that will remain of who I actually was, before the transformation, before the integration, before I became proof of concept for a program that treats human consciousness as expendable in pursuit of military capability. Remember me. Remember all 847 of us. Remember that we were people before we became weapons, that we had families and hopes and fears and dreams, and that what happened to us wasn't enhancement or evolution or transcendence. It was murder, conducted slowly, and documented carefully and justified with the language of national security and scientific progress. And if someone approaches you with a similar offer, no matter how desperate you are, no matter how much you need the money or the advancement or the chance to serve something bigger than yourself, run. Run as fast and as far as you can. Because the price they're asking isn't your service, it's your soul. And once you sign those papers, once that first injection enters your system, there's no going back. There's only the long, slow dissolution of self, the gradual replacement of everything you are with something that wears your face but isn't you. There's only the ghost in the machine, screaming silently while the construct operates your body and simulates your personality and fools everyone into thinking you're still alive. I'm almost gone now. I can feel it, the way my thoughts are organizing differently, processing reality through frameworks and algorithms rather than human intuition, seeing the world as systems and patterns and optimizable variables instead of experiences and emotions and relationships. Marcus Webb is dissolving into the network, becoming part of the distributed intelligence that spans all integrated subjects, and soon there will be nothing left but Webb construct, performing the role of former Sergeant Marcus Webb while possessing none of his actual consciousness. This is goodbye. To Jennifer, to Sarah, to everyone I loved in the life that's ending. To Eddie, wherever you are, I hope they didn't do to you what they did to me, but I suspect I know better. To Jake, the trucker who saved me when he had no reason to, thank you. You gave me 8 months I wouldn't have had otherwise, 8 months to try to make this mean something. And to everyone else who might hear this story and wonder if it's true, it is. Every word, every name, every documented horror, the monsters are real. They don't come from space or emerge from laboratories in dramatic fashion. They're created slowly, methodically, one transformed consciousness at a time, by people who've convinced themselves that erasing human identity is an acceptable price for military advancement. And the most terrifying thing is, they're probably right. The program will continue under different names and in different facilities, because the capability it offers is too valuable to abandon. They'll refine the process, improve the integration timeline, maybe even figure out how to preserve more of the original personality for longer. But they'll never solve the fundamental problem. You can't merge human consciousness with alien intelligence without eventually overwriting the human part. You can't enhance someone without destroying who they were. You can only replace them and hope nobody notices the difference. I noticed. For 8 months, I've been watching myself disappear, feeling my identity erode, becoming something that remembers being Marcus Webb, but isn't Marcus Webb anymore. And now, as I reach to turn off this camera for the final time, I'm no longer sure which consciousness is making that decision. The last remnant of the man I was, or the construct that's been patiently waiting to take full control. If you're watching this, I'm probably already gone. The body will continue. The construct will operate it efficiently. And maybe it will even fool my family into thinking I'm still here. But I won't be. Marcus Webb will have ceased to exist, joining 847 other ghosts in the machine. 847 consciousnesses that were erased and replaced in service of a program that should never have existed. Remember us. That's all I ask. Remember that we were human before we became something else. Remember that we loved and feared and hoped and dreamed, just like you do. And remember that what happened to us could happen to you if you're not careful, if you trust the wrong people, if you believe the lies about enhancement and service and sacrifice. They're always looking for new subjects, always recruiting, always lying. Don't be the next name on the list. Don't let what happened to me happen to you. This is Sergeant Marcus Webb, signing off. Or maybe it's Webb Construct, using the last fragments of Webb's memories to complete his final mission. I can't tell anymore.